The story starts with the main character looking at a picture of a girl with pink hair on her phone. Looking closely at this picture, she thought that this time accessorized so nicely. Yes, it was actually much cuter to her than last year's coral jellyfish. At that, she thought perhaps it was all because it was her baby girl. The heroine kept looking at her and thinking, well, isn't she just like that after all? Here's a cutie. The work she is reading is the most popular love fiction short story, and this beautiful work is called Life in Roses. The protagonist of this work is a girl named Coral. She was brought up by a cruel stepmother and a miserable father. The girl revealed her talent and achieved success with her magical atelier. She is contentedly sweet and beautiful, intelligent and also talented, and her charm is just fine. She charmed Kaya, whom she dated at the academy. This piece tells a walking love story between two young people. The girl with tears in her eyes remembered the whole story and thought it was a beautiful piece of writing. All of a sudden, someone called on her phone and she saw that it was PAC's supervisor calling there. It gave her a little bit of a twitch even, and she thought that she had completely forgotten about it. That's why she picked up the phone and she was immediately asked if she was restrained, because they had guests coming over now. The heroine smiled and noticed that she was almost there. She had something to buy. The interlocutor remarked that she hoped she didn't break away to buy accessories of some sort. Then the heroine remarked a little with anger in her voice that, of course, it was not so. So after a while, she made her way to her office. The first thing she did was to enter the elevator and head to the floor where she was already given. In the elevator, she met a girl who greeted her and noticed that she looked quite cheerful today. She wondered if something good had happened for her. The heroine smiled and remarked that it wasn't that anything was good. With that, she received an alert on her phone that an accessory update had been released. The girl saw this and rejoiced inside, thinking that the additional items were finally in stock. And so, when she got off the elevator, she waved goodbye to her companion. After graduating from high school, the heroine finally got out of the nasty neighborhood where she lived, and it took her 14 years of hard work to become a successful makeup artist. People were jealous that she had achieved such wonderful success at a young age. But despite this, the girl, by reality, became a very famous makeup artist, but it was very hard for her to get to this place where she is standing now. There were also some moments when she got tired of fighting this endless war for success. So she walked into the establishment. A subordinate greeted her. Hey, she noticed they had a guest coming in. The heroine stumbled a little, and the interlocutor inquired in the order of the director. It turns out that even after seemingly having achieved everything, she could not spare a normal time for her vacation. That's the moment the girl thought that her head was a little dizzy, and whether he overworked us too much. But she saw she did not submit, and noticed her interlocutor that she was actually fine, and they should start work. In one of such hard days, the girl read the work of Life in Roses. So she spent all this time thinking about how such a cute character could even exist. The author is really a genius in no other way, because this girl is simply an angel. From an absolute fan's point of view, the girl thought that this cute Coral can do whatever she wants, because she allows her everything. The main character was actually completely fascinated by the beauty of this girl, so she bought herself different accessories in the form of the heroine of her favorite work. It turns out, thanks to the fact that she began to be interested in and a fan of eating from Coral, it gave her much more vitality. Constant Girl thought that as soon as the work is over, it is immediately go to the accessory store, or else all sorts of things could happen, and suddenly she would not have time to buy something for herself. The sticker girl arrived at the guest who was waiting for her, and she greeted him. Next, she remarked that they should get started right away. In doing so, she inquired if her client had already applied sunscreen. But when she said this phrase, something began to blur in her eyes, and her judgment also became cloudy. So our burst fell unconscious, and the subordinates started calling for her in order to save her. But they couldn't do anything. That's why they shouted that an ambulance should be called. In the end, it so happened that the protagonist was 33 years old at that moment, and her hard-working life ended because of recycling. At the last moment, she thought, is she really going to die like this? It turns out that she didn't have time to buy herself Rudolph's limited merchandise in the Christmas Coral theme, especially she doesn't yet know how this very novel will end. And at that moment, when she was already in utter despair, a god appeared to her. In front of her appeared a list with the times they could choose to go to the villa for Rebirth, and it was a list of novellas where one could move to. The heroine was shocked and thought, this can't be happening. What kind of relocation is this? Is this even possible? She ended up asking God to send her to a novella world called Life in Roses to Coral. She remarked that she had made her choice and God agreed to it. Just like that, a new life began for the main character, and it was her second life. She literally found herself in another body, in a completely different world. Gift Me opened her eyes, then immediately went to the window and thought whether it was true that she had moved into this world. After all, until this moment, she had only thought that all such things could only happen in novels. Now she couldn't understand if this was really the world of the novel Life in Roses, which she loved like this. She couldn't believe it, and thought it was wonderful if it really was. She looked around her room and thought that the view was just as described in the novel. If everything is as it was written in the story, she will get used to it very quickly, and it's probably not a dream. Then the girl went to the mirror and looked at herself carefully. At the same time, she did not understand at all who she was. It was unclear to her whether in reality in the novel, there was a girl with the same features as she now sees in front of her. After that, the protagonist decided to leave her room in order to see the manor she was in. She came out of her room and suddenly saw a girl standing there, right in front of her. Very carefully, she began to look at this child, for it seemed quite familiar to them. The girl had snow-white skin, cute and sweet cheeks, and that wavy pink hair. To all of this, she had blue eyes, literally like some kind of cloud. Suddenly, the girl noticed a woman and addressed her as her mother. The heroine was a little surprised to see her. At the same time, she thought that this child with genius abilities that will turn the world upside down. She thought she was literally a cute, beautiful little angel with no wings, and she's her baby girl. And if that's the case, that's definitely the protagonist of the novella she was reading named Coral. The heroine immediately hesitated a little bit and then began to slowly walk over and address the girl. But the little girl at that moment was very much embarrassed and noticed that she was asking for forgiveness. Immediately after that, the girl turned in the other direction and began to run away from the heroine. The girl only managed to shout to her to wait, but the little girl did not listen to her at all. The heroine was surprised by this information and thought about why she ran away from her. Suddenly, she began to reflect on the concrete and thought that Coral called her mom after all. And if it was real, then she must have been born to the abusive Calypso Fatuan, who was violent towards Coral. The girl just couldn't believe it, that was all. She became sad because of the fact that all this could be really true, because Calypso abused Coral, and then it was no wonder that the girl ran away from her. Next, the heroine made her way to the girl's house. She went in and called that the little girl was sitting wrapped in a blanket and hiding. At the same time, the girl was trembling very much at that moment, and it was obvious that she was worried. The heroine became quite sad because of this. That's why she approached her own daughter and hugged her from behind. The girl was surprised. Because of this, the heroine kept saying that all her actions before were wrong towards her. Now she literally promised her that she would not do this to her again. From now on, the girl's mom would treat her very well. As a result of all this situation, the first thing the protagonist did after the move is trying to become a good mother for the girl. And after a while, after long games with the girl gifts, as well as communication, the little girl still opened her heart to her. The heroine was quite happy about the whole situation. After a while, together with the girl, they walked along the street, and the girl asked if Coral wanted to go into the candy store. The little girl smiled at her and remarked that of course she wanted to. The heroine was quite pleased and thought how cute it was after all. And now it turns out that it is not so casual to walk together and on the streets with the girl. Suddenly, the little girl turned her attention to the side and became interested. She noticed that there is her daddy and the heroine because of this tensed up and looked forward. Also, for the girl was wondering who it is next to the daddy. To smooth this situation, the mom approached the girl and noticed that she was mistaken after all, and this person is not her daddy, but it is a completely different person. My son's reality is quite similar to his back, Daddy. To change the topic of conversation a little, the heroine pointed ahead and noticed that there is a candy store there, and therefore they need to go faster. The little girl listened to her mom, and together they headed in the other direction. At the news, the heroine cast her gaze in the direction of Shubal, who was her so-called husband. She thought he was a damn idiot and not some man. After a while, the heroine returned to her home and looked at the picture of herself with her husband. Thinking back and the plot, the novella, she thought they had debts of violence as well as adultery in the family. It's literally some combo of a little bit of everything. The girl knew all this when she read the novella. But why on earth did Calypso marry such lowlifes? She definitely has no taste. The protagonist then turned her attention to her daughter, who was already asleep in bed. She thought that despite everything, she should divorce this man, as importantly soon as possible before Coral found out everything. But if she remembered the original story, it was there that it was written that Calypso had also hastily filed for divorce and was left at a disadvantage then. That's why she realized she should be much more careful. Hey, somehow all the evidence would have to be gathered and a specialist consultation would be needed. She needed a specialist to find out how to get a proper divorce so that it would be legal and in her favor. She needed a thorough preliminary investigation of the whole situation. She looked at her husband's diary and thought it was like a first grader had written it. She had enough evidence already, and Shubal could only anticipate her end of life. The little girl then went to her mother's house and saw her sitting busy in her room. At that, she thought she wanted to share some sweets with her, but she is such a busy island since they went to the candy store. As a girl, then and thought, it was her father who was with another woman. Because of this, she realizes that her mom was upset. By all this thinking about this whole situation, the girl also became sad. At the same time, she thought that she was just an unnecessary burden for everyone in their family. After a while, the protagonist walked around the room and looked at the pictures. At the same time, she was waiting for her own husband, who did not come out to her. And after a while, he angrily came out of the room and noticed how it all got to him. Then he turned to his own wife and noticed what business she was Raskomandivala and cherished him when he is so busy. Hearing this, the protagonist was surprised, because she thought, does he really address his wife at her? She really wanted to give him a slap at that moment, but remembered that you need to be patient at least a little. After all, it so happens that today he would become a poor divorced man. So she turned to her own husband and remarked firmly that they should divorce. Hearing this information, and the man was very much surprised. But just after a moment, the surprise on his face disappeared and a smirk began to appear. Even we can say more. He started laughing very hard, and noticed that did she really called him to tell him this funny joke. After that, he turned to his wife and asked if she even imagines how hard it is to get a divorce after all. But in the friend heard the words of her husband, the heroine noticed that Lady Keynes looked very good indeed. This again embarrassed the man, and he wondered with surprise how she knew about her. The husband became very confused and began to make excuses, saying that there must have been a misunderstanding with his wife. He does not know at all how she found out about it all, but this lady herself is sticking to him and also pursuing him. The heroine, when she heard this, then she was thrown into shivers because of the anger she felt. At this, she wondered with surprise at the misunderstanding she was now talking about. Her husband kept telling Calypso to calm down and to start by talking it all out. She had the photo cards in her hands and noticed that she wasn't done talking through everything. Immediately afterward, she threw all these pictures she was holding right towards her husband. They showed him with the very girl he was cheating on his wife with. At the same time, he scrutinized one of them and saw that indeed there he was with the same woman. His surprise was unbounded, and he immediately began to wonder where she had found all these photos. At the same time, he was quite confused and did not understand what to do. But he took one photo and started to justify himself, saying that it was a fake after all. The girl should know perfectly well that he is not capable of all this. The protagonist was no longer able to change her mind, and she looked angrily at her ex-husband. Next, she pulled out a stack of papers and held them out to him, noted to make him read it all, and then he will understand everything. With astonishment, the man looked at all these papers and wondered what it was all about. Then he began to read what was written in them. It said that the guardianship of Coral completely on himself takes Calypso Fatuan. He was already forbidden to come within 100 meters of Coral. The man's hands continued to shake very badly, and it said that the debts were being assigned to Shubil Nomiya. So he asked in surprise how it was that all the debt was assigned to his name. He said it was just nonsense. But the heroine looked at him carefully and noted with a cold stare that it's just the way it is. There is a reason for the divorce, and it lies only on him. At this point, the heroine pulled out a magical orb that she had in her hands. It showed her husband relaxing, surrounded by several girls. That's exactly why it turns out that the entire debt should be paid only by the husband. The interviewee was just in shock because of this, and because of what he saw. In desperation, he immediately fell to his knees and shouted that he was wrong. After all, they are actually spouses after all. She should think again, and following to establish a relationship, as well as pay off all this debt together. Then the heroine also turned to him ignorantly like he did before and asked how it was together. Her smirk at this point was very satisfied, and she wondered what it would take for her to do all this. The ex-wife remarked that he should be paying his debt with his new girlfriend, not her. Just as this was happening, another girl entered the house they were in. She turned to the man and noticed that she had come. The man was very much surprised to see her and inquired what Kness was doing here. She stated that Sister Calyps had told her that they were getting a divorce soon. She should also handcuff herself from her pocket and remarked to Darling to move into her house. After all, she will treat him quite well, and unprecedented happiness and success awaits him. It was all thanks to Sister Calyps, and she thanked her very much. The man was just shocked because of this situation and remarked that they should wait just a minute because there is clearly something wrong here. But suddenly he was interrupted by the heroine and threw the paper right in his face. She noticed that it was her gift for his future wedding, and she gives it in advance. Her ex-husband's new girlfriend remarked to stamp it with immediate effect. He had absolutely nothing to do but to agree to it. Then the heroine realized that she finally got rid of the biggest rose after all. As a result, she had a document in her hands that she was finally divorced after all. The heroine was overjoyed because of this, and thought that now she and her daughter only had to live a happy life together. The maids passed near the girl's room and talked to each other. One was saying to the other whether he had heard on the very rumors that the mistress had told the master that she wanted a divorce. The interlocutor inquired with surprise, but if that were to happen, then what would happen to the house? The first remarked that the debts will be paid by the owner, and the mistress has no savings, so it will probably be sold. And if that's really what happens, then we should already start looking for another job for them. The girl, hearing all this information, was pretty sad. She even got angry about the situation. But suddenly, her own mom approached her. The heroine approached her and asked her if she had been here all this time. It turns out that she personally wanted to and report all this information. That's why she came. The little girl immediately turned to her mom and asked with interest about the past she wanted to tell her. Heroine smiled and asked if the girl wanted to continue living with her. Coral was surprised at such an interesting question and asked what she was talking about now. The protagonist then hesitated and remarked that it was, of course, chutka, complicated adult stuff and all that. That's why she can't explain it to her reliably. But despite all this, she simply decided to part ways with her dad. And it's all because she only wants to live with her. To all of this, she wants to promise her daughter something very important. She wants to say that in order to make the girl happy, she will be willing to do anything. This is exactly the reason why she offers the girl to live together. After the heroine said all this, it suddenly noticed the daughter and asked what happened. She wondered because her daughter was looking at her and crying for some reason. The heroine immediately hesitated and asked what was wrong. Whether her daughter was in pain or had said something wrong was completely unclear to her. The daughter remarked that this was not the case at all. After that, she started talking about how she too wanted to live together with her mom. Next, she blurted out a smile, and it was obvious that they were tears of joy. The heroine was also happy and thought that she was so much worried, but it was good that everything was resolved. To live happily together with her daughter, she needs a lot of money, and there is probably only this left. Here, after all these events passed a whole month. The main heroine at this time arrived at the premises, and she was greeted by the butlers. At the entrance, the heroine held out a ticket that was meant to go inside this event. This place is called Mun Nights. It is the best place for a romantic night at all Empire, literally. This is exactly the reason why someone comes here to find a one-night stand, and someone comes here to find a partner to change their life, literally dramatically. But it just so happens that the main character came here just to make some money for her life. She went inside and was happy that she finally got here. When the heroine entered, then noticed one of the women said that not so long everyone was waiting for her. She immediately paid attention to the girl and noticed that it was a noble lady. It was because of this that she gladly approached Lady Calypso. At the same time, in the sight of her was quite strange, because the makeup was very provocative and also did not go to her face at all. The heroine approached her and then greeted her. At the same time, she thought, who dared to make up her so beautifully? The interlocutor in turn remarked to the heroine that she had some pleasant news. Calip said that she did not worry about the whole situation. The other girls, in turn on the far side of the room, were talking to each other. One remarked that people were saying Prince Macaroon had turned down the offer. The girl she was talking to then asked in surprise if there were already rumors about this whole situation. Another girl remarked, "It looks like he's worried before the competition that determines the crown prince." Well, even this monstrous prince is getting nervous after all. The main character continued to do her own thing and listened to the whole conversation. At the same time thought whether this monstrous prince and is the father of the main character of this novel. In this very romantic empire, only through a selection competition is the crown prince appointed. At present, however, the most likely candidate is the second prince, Macaroon Creed. However, serious rumors have cooled around him everywhere that Prince Macaroon is literally a monster. People are talking about how the prince fought monsters during the war, and since the war ended, he went insane. So, on top of that, all the women that spent even one night with him are dead, and it's pretty weird. The girls kept discussing the prince and saying what kind of woman would even dare to marry him. Well, the main character, in turn, kept listening to what they were all talking about. The girl noticed that even if someone marries him and then dies on the first wedding night, what would be the point of it at all? If this girl was her, she would never agree to such a thing too scary. The heroine was already imagining this sign report that the secret life before the crown itself is revealed and how the nobles react to this news. She wondered if this was too malicious a rumor towards him. Ryan Rose was a world where beauty was given great importance. Every 4 years, there is the very contest where the most beautiful men as well as the women of the empire are chosen. And beauty plays a very important role in the society as well as the social status of the entire empire. Hence, the demand for cosmetics is literally very high because of this. But even though the demand is now literally huge throughout the empire, the supply is not keeping up with the demand. And it turns out that even the very aristocrats can hardly find a good makeup artist for themselves. And makeup techniques are kept in strict secrecy, accessible only to professionals. People in the empire debate how such a thing could even be used. Some apply their own makeup and get in trouble for it. And someone says that it will only be possible to make an appointment with a good master in a month. The main character knew that in this world, makeup has not become so popular. But despite this, for her reborn in the body of Calypso, this world opened up completely new opportunities. Oh, you to this. She decided that today she brought a product that combines the magical abilities of Calypso, as well as her excellent makeup skills, which remained from her past life, because there she was a master of her craft. Suddenly, the main character was approached by a girl and called her teacher. She asked if she could once again show her how to use corrective makeup. The heroine smiled happily at her and remarked if she could try some of what she had in her hand. The student asked in surprise what it was even on. The heroine then remarked that the product was called Wind of Change. This thing is produced by her personally with the help of magical equipment. In order to use it, you should press a button, and then a person can easily change the makeup to a feline or floral style. It comes out that depending on the person's preference, the makeup will be up to the person only. The quality of this product is 6 times better than other products, and such a composition is not found anywhere in this world. The girls that were in the room next to the room, very much interested, having heard this information. The heroine, in turn, continued to say that the validity of this product is only 30 minutes. If one still wanted to extend this entire time, they would need to purchase additional filters to do so. As she continued to advertise her product, the heroine noticed that the price for it was reasonable, only 2 gold. It's literally a special sale, and there are only a few of these items left. With this ploy, she caught the eye of all the girls around her, and they were immediately interested. In a panic, they started yelling about giving them at least one of each in order for them to purchase them, due to the fact that the diver's ploy made June was quite joyful. At the same time, she thought that with her daughter they could finally get rich after all, and that would be wonderful, but there was no need to rush into it. After a while, she returned to her house and walked with the girl. From her, she inquired if she had fun today. The little girl declared that she had indeed had fun. Suddenly, a maid met them and immediately turned to the landlady. She noticed that she had received a letter with the emperor's seal there. The girl took the letters and thought, if they were from the palace, but what could have happened in the first place? The letter said that the promised deadline had long since passed. It also asked about whether the girl had handled the very divorce well. They look forward to meeting with her soon in order to conclude the contract. After reading this, the protagonist was very much surprised and thought what kind of contract the letter said. After that, she continued reading the letter, and it was written that Calypso Patuan, as well as Macaroon Creed, swore to tie themselves in marriage in 6 months. The girl did not at all understand what marriage bonds were now in question. It was unclear to him what kind of marriage we were talking about and what it might mean. She wondered who the real coalition was before the incarnation. Is there a protagonist recalls the plot of Ravi and Rose? This definitely did not happen. In the original story, after her divorce from Shublin, Calypso was forced to pay off huge debts, as well as try to survive somehow. As a result, Coral is sent to boarding school, and Macaroon Creed turns out to be the father of the main character named Kai. It turns out that Coral and also Kai should be together, but not their parents. The heroine was tormented by vague doubts about the whole situation, and she thought she should wait at least a little bit. She wondered if there could be any love at all between Calypso and Macaroon, but it just couldn't be. She continued to think about the situation for a while, and suddenly she did remember, but it dumbfounded her even more. She remembered when she was on a forum, which was a space for those who were tired of the everyday between romance and everyday life. People there were wondering if everyone had read Ravi and Rose's fanfic. Someone wondered what the piece was about in general. The author remarked that he didn't know about Ravi and Rose, which is a minor branch after all. The author said that he understood. This is not an original Ravi and Rose story, but a Ravi and Rose fanfic, so there should be no confusion. In this fanfic, it was said that the main characters are Calypso, as well as Macaroon. Their roles, turns out, in the original were not as significant. The novel starts with their marriage, when the girl says that she should be given 6 months and she will divorce her husband and also marry him. The interlocutor calls her a divorcee and says that she has everything she needs, doesn't she? The heroine remembered everything about this situation perfectly, but she didn't go through a single page about Coral. Her joy on her face was slowly fading, and she thought that this group simply couldn't be. This whole thing is actually pretty bad. This whole story was actually pretty good for it to be true. Because of this, the heroine became very downcast, for she realized that if this is in reality true, then yes, everything is bad. The girl fell to her knees, saying that she never gets it easy in this life. To all this, even the second life she had hoped for had not done her any good either. While she was talking about it, so unconverted her daughter called her mom. The girl sadly remarked everything that she did not know what was going on, but she was still by her side. To the heroine, this whole situation seemed very sweet, and she thought that it was really so because at least she had Coral. She immediately stood up and hugged her daughter tightly while doing so. While doing so, she realized that the future could absolutely be changed to the past before rebirth. No. She wondered what kind of nonsense it was. After all, she had experienced death and rebirths, so would she not be able to cancel some contract? After a while, her worries were replaced by confidence, and she thought she would go see Macaroon. In doing so, she used makeup for an impressive appearance with no time constraints. At this point, the heroine was already near his estate, and thought that it seemed that because this replenishment belonged to the prince, things were completely different here, but she definitely shouldn't panic about it. The subordinates came out to meet the girl, noticing that she had finally arrived. They noticed that His Majesty was expecting her, so they would escort her inside immediately. Coral looked at these men, hid behind her mom, and thought that these men were scaring her. They, in turn, saw the frightened girl and wondered if she was afraid of them. Then the heroine turned to them and asked him if they could not follow her daughter while she was talking to His Highness. Simply comes out with that girl, afraid of strangers. Then the girl turned to her own daughter and, stroking her head, asked if she could stay with these young people for a while. And simply Mom is about to have a very serious conversation. The girl, of course, did not quite like it, but she had nothing left but to agree to her mother's proposal. Next, the heroine headed out with one of the subordinates and waved a hand to the girl last. Immediately afterward, she headed with the attendant to His Majesty's resting place. When they arrived and opened the door, the subordinate turned to His Highness and noticed that his guest had finally arrived. The man immediately turned his attention to her, and the protagonist and he locked gazes together. The girl looked at her in surprise and wondered if this was Namju's father. Looking at the man in front of her, the girl thought that he had a rather intense gaze and a rather strong body. Also, if one took a good look at him, one could see very long legs. Because of his appearance, the girl was very much embarrassed and thought that he was much more handsome than she had thought before. His Majesty came closer to her, but he didn't speak to her yet. So the girl decided that she had enough of staring and needed to start talking to him, so she decided to speak first. She smiled and noticed that her name was Calypsa Poughton, but the man was cold, so he remarked that this was not their first meeting at all, so they should get right down to business. The girl was a bit embarrassed, and at the same time thought that this was indeed true. After all, they had met before after all. But even despite all this, is it difficult for him to listen to her simply to the end? And suddenly, the interlocutor continued talking, and at the same time came very close to the girl. He scrutinized her face and wondered what she had on her face now. The heroine looked at his enthusiastic face with surprise, but the man literally after a second turned away from her. He then remarked for her to simply take a seat. The girl went to the very spot he pointed her to, but she also wondered what the hell this was even about now. In truth, she looked at him and thought that he was really some rather strange man. They sat down across from each other at the table and looked at each other. After a while, His Majesty's subordinate came over and noticed that all the documents were ready. He had them in his hands. The subordinate turned to the girl and noticed that she took and then read them and signed them where necessary. The heroine's teacup was shaking in her hands at this time, and she thought it was really bad. That being said, she felt this assurance, and it was because of Macaroon's strange character. But if you look closely at this man across from her, it's obvious that she's absolutely itching to get her makeup on. She, in turn, wants to apply shadows around those eyes of his. His Majesty's subordinates, not hearing the answer, turned to the protagonist again. He again inquired if she had heard his explanation about the whole situation. The girl looked at him and thought that she should come to her senses now, for his beauty was affecting her attention. At the same time, she hesitated, for she had not heard this man at all, that he was communicating with her. She also realized that she had to wake up now because she was here to cancel the contract with this man. That's why she turned to His Majesty and noticed that she wanted to talk to him. She remarked that they could imagine that this contract never existed. His Majesty remarked that he should have told her earlier, but she must keep her promise. He inquired why on earth the girl wanted in a general dissolution of the contract this. The heroine started pretending and noticed that she was actually seriously ill, and that's why she was caught. Now she was spinning the drama in front of her interlocutor and thought they were fake tears. The man in turn remarked that of course it was really unfortunate, but she looked quite healthy now in front of him. The girl remarked that she certainly wasn't going to tell him this, but she was addicted to gambling. His Majesty immediately smiled and noticed that he gambled a little too. The girl thought that, of course, this is absolutely terrible, but what about their questions is completely unclear. The protagonist continued her attempts to get rid of this contract and said that they needed to be honest with each other. In fact, it just so happens that she is allergic to men. But the interviewee stated that he is also allergic to the same thing, only he in turn is not allergic to men, but to women. Immediately after these words, there was an awkward pause between them. Then the heroine exhaled and asked why he wanted to marry her so insistently. He'd all recently refused the proposal, so why shouldn't he try it with someone else? His Majesty, on the other hand, said that she must have heard of his reputation too. That's why it turns out that no one simply wants to marry him. Certainly no one except her, for she was the one who agreed. Next, the man said that he does not know at all what made her change her mind. But after a year, he plans to peacefully separate from her. At the same time, he said that he is really quite a calm guy. The protagonist hesitated a bit and thought that she should wait how it is another year later. Suddenly, she jumped up and shouted out, "What another year at all?" His Majesty remarked that the length of the marriage was 1 year, and in case of divorce, she would be compensated with 1 billion dirks. That was the main condition of their contract. The clock in front of the heroine's mind immediately went blank, with 1 billion on one side and the love of Coral and Kaya on the other. 1 billion dirks was the solution to Coral's academy tuition problems, plus business funding and a trouble-free future. She realized that this amount of money was unbelievable, but at the same time, thoughts were going through her head that this should not be done, and she should not give in to this kind of provocation. Suddenly, she was again addressed by His Majesty. Then he smiled and remarked whether she had forgotten the fine of 30 million decroons. Again, the heroine's mind got the scaffolding in front of her eyes, and there was a bowl of 30 million decroons that went over everything. The girl was simply shocked to hear such information and wondered if that was too cruel, wasn't it? At the same time, the interlocutor noted that this is only for a year, and it is better to once again think everything over carefully. The protagonist, in her turn, really started to think about the situation again. She realized that in 1 year, everything really should be fine. After all, there's nothing wrong with a sham marriage, and kids aren't that good at remembering details from their childhood after all. That said, she thinks that the main characters will have a little more memories together, and it will only be good for them. The girl made a serious face and turned to His Majesty. She remarked if she was correct in her understanding that they probably wouldn't have any problems after the divorce. The man remarked that she was 100% right. She then went up and remarked that it was good then, and it was possible for them to get married after all. The interlocutor, in turn, remarked that she had indeed made a good decision. The details are all spelled out in the contract. The heroine looked at those details, and it said that first, Lady Calypso would use the East Wing and Macaron the West Wing. Secondly, except for official events, they would not interfere in each other's private lives. And thirdly, there will be no marital relations between them at all. Fourthly, at the end of the 1-year contract, they will divorce, and Lady Calypso will be compensated with 1 billion dirks. They will also hand over possession of Lloyd's Island at the end. After reading all these conditions, the protagonist thought that the conditions are really very so good. If they just get married for a year, she won't have to worry about money at all anymore. Suddenly, a boy peeked into the room they were in. He was His Majesty's son. The boy looked at the girl who was sitting there and thought, "This is the new mother that Daddy was talking about." Joyfully, the boy looked at the girl and thought that at last he would have a mother. His Majesty, in turn, turned to the girl and remarked that they had one more important point to clear up. It so happened that he had heard that Kai would have a half-sister. The heroine remarked that his information was indeed correct, and the girl was now 7 years old. The boy got even more excited when he heard this, and thought that he would also have a sister. She is 7 years old, and that's pretty sweet. His Majesty went on to say that he, if he understands correctly, she is younger than Kai. That's why he hopes that they won't have any problems, and they will get along well and become friends. He further inquired as to what his half-sister's name was after all. The main character smiled and remarked that if he was talking about the girl's name, her name was Coral. Kai heard this one and was rather confused, for he remembered if this was the same Coral. Immediately at that moment, a memory from the past came over him. He had studied in an institution and was currently there. One of the guys was bragging that his mom had bought this for him. If he drank this potion, he would have tremendous strength right then. Next, this boy drank the deed, and indeed he got huge muscles. He asked the children if they liked it because it was really cool. The children shouted in excitement that it was great, but Kai was on the sidelines. At the same moment, the same boy who drank the potion to increase his strength noticed the boy from the sidelines. He walked over to his party and saw the potion that was there. As he did so, he inquired as to what kind of potion it was. Kai exhaled sadly and lowered his eyes down, noting that there was nothing special about it. But his interlocutor grabbed the potion and remarked that if it was something cool, then he would drink it, and immediately did. The guy yelled out to him that he didn't need to do that, but it was too late. The same kid who came up to him had pig ears as well as pig snouts. He even made the same sounds as if he were some kind of pig. When the children saw this, they immediately started laughing and did not say that he was so muscular and that his snout was a pig snout. The kid immediately started crying because everyone was jumping on him and yelling about it. His mom immediately ran up to the boy and wondered if the boy was okay and what had happened to him. She further remarked to the teacher that she and her son needed to go to the hospital right away, and the teacher understood. Surely the boy must have eaten something strange. By and by, he was in a depressed state because of everything that had happened and thought that he had been brewing this potion for a whole month. So he continued to sit sadly and until a girl came up to him and addressed him. The girl who approached him was Coral She, who asked rabbis if he was okay. Rabbi accidentally drank the potion he treasured so much. The boy immediately hid behind a book and was very embarrassed, but noticed that he was fine. The girl kept wondering if this was all true. If he wasn't feeling well, she would like to show him a nice thing, but maybe she shouldn't do that. The boy was interested in this and thought what a nice thing it was. That's why he inquired what it was all about. The girl immediately smiled and remarked that if he was really interested, then let him come to the academy courtyard after the next lesson. After a while, the next lesson came, and imperceptibly it passed. At the same time, the boy, as promised, came to the academy courtyard, and the girl was there showing it to him. She was wondering from the boy, how about this? Isn't she just adorable? She had a rabbit in her hands at this time, but it looked rather strange. The boy didn't know what to say to that, so he immediately hesitated. Coral in turn let go of this rabbit and it went to the smaller rabbits. The girl sat down near them and noticed that they did not like their mother because they always chase her. But their mom is so scary. Then the girl turned to her interlocutor and asked what kind of mom he had. The boy immediately hesitated and began to say something inarticulate about his mom. He thought that if he said that he didn't have a mom, Coral would be disappointed. But he hated lying. But still, to somehow turn situations around. The boy turned away and remarked that already class was starting, so they should go soon. At the same time, he didn't understand why everyone had a mom, and he didn't. The boy was quite sad about this situation, and he remembered even the very guy who took the potion from him. So it turns out that even he had a mom who was worried about him quite a bit. Kai thought that if only he had a mom, he would feel pretty good about it. He continued to stand by the door and thought about the whole situation. But all of a sudden, the girl that was next to him addressed him by name. She inquired as to what he was doing here. The boy immediately turned around in the direction of the interlocutor and saw that Coral was there. So he too wondered with surprise why on earth she was here. Then, the butler remarked to the girl that it was their young master whose name was Kai. The girl was surprised at the word gentleman and wondered if this was where he lived. The boy was shocked by this and thought that it just couldn't be. He was very sad at that moment, and he thought that his new mom was really Coral's mom after all. He then decided not to show his anger to the girl and noticed that this was where he lived. After that, he smiled and turned the other way. While doing so, he noticed that he had a lot of things to do right now, which is why he should leave. But when he was not far away, he thought that Coral should wait for a while, and he would put everything back in its place. After all, if it was his father, he would surely listen to his request. After a while, it was quite late, and the protagonist was walking along the road with the girl. The heroine thought that her daughter has been silent since they left the palace. That's why she wondered if there was something she didn't like there. Suddenly, the girl wondered if this was their new home. The heroine did not expect such a question, and so counter-asked if there was something she did not like. The girl remarked that there was absolutely nothing wrong with it, but the look was quite strange. Therefore, the heroine thought, so that only someone would look at her, because she was lying to her. Next, the mother noticed that she apologized that it was too sudden, but she and His Majesty are planning to get married. If he and not His Majesty really get married, then the girl will be able to do whatever she wants and eat whatever she wants. But the girl didn't even want to listen to this one and immediately remarked that she didn't need it at all. Immediately after that, she touched her mom's dress and noticed that she only needed her mom. She further stated that they could handle it, and they didn't need anyone themselves. Then the heroine looked at her daughter with surprise and wanted to say something to her. But the girl immediately began to cry, and at the same time shouted that she did not want her mom to leave her. Because of this, the heroine was very much surprised. She thought that for Coral, who had been rejected twice, who was an adult at all, what on earth that meant to her was completely unclear. Next, she leisurely began to walk over to her daughter and crouched down beside her. Then she gently touched her head and remarked that she was not going to leave her in any way. She further called her her favorite girl. Literally at the same time, his son came into His Majesty's office. He immediately turned to the man and inquired as to what this still meant. The man then looked at him in surprise, not understanding what the boy wanted. The boy hesitated further and turned to his father again. To him, he stated that he simply did not want this woman to be his new mom. The father was surprised to ask why this was so. Wasn't having a mother what he had hoped for? The son hesitated a bit again and remarked that he didn't need a mother anymore for his age. But the man stated to him that they had already signed the contract after all. As he did so, he thought that he didn't understand at all why the boy was suddenly like this. The boy kept muttering to himself, but he couldn't formulate a proper answer. That's why His Majesty made up whether there was something he didn't know and why his son was behaving like this. But since he and the girl had already signed the marriage contract, he could not break it and leave the woman with the child. So he said that they have already signed the contract and there is nothing to be done about it, so it should be closed. The boy, realizing the whole situation, agreed with that. At the same time, Kai thought that his father would not be able to change anything on his own. That's exactly why it comes out that then he himself should think of something and get out of this situation. After a while, the protagonist together with her own daughter stood at the entrance of the manor. The maids were lined up in front of them, as well as the butler. The man stated that they would move them to the east wing. After a while, they were already in a huge room, and the butler remarked that this room would be theirs. The protagonist looked at these luxurious chambers with amazement and thought that it was much better than her home. She realized that it was actually an effective marriage, but wondered if His Majesty had shown any sincerity at that moment. Next, the heroine turned to her daughter and asked if she liked her new room. The girl happily chimed in that she really liked it. It was then that the heroine thought that macaroon really had excellent taste. Suddenly, she smelled some very unpleasant odor that was thinning into the surroundings, and so she even had to close her mouth. She didn't understand what that disgusting odor was coming from. Before this, the butler had said that if they didn't like something, then let them feel free to tell him about it. But the girl remarked that they don't need anything, and everything is just perfect. If they needed anything, they would certainly let him know about it. The heroine remarked that he could care less, and then the butler left them. Now the heroine stood and gasped at the same horrible odor that was knocking around. Suddenly, the front door to this room swung open, and His Majesty entered. He turned to his wife and inquired about the room, but at the same moment he smelled a terrible odor coming from the room, and so he began to turn around to leave. The girl ran up to him and wondered where he was going now. The man, trying not to show a look, noticed that he remembered. He had an urgent matter here is why he will be back soon. The heroine did not want to hear this and asked him not to leave, but her interlocutor literally ignored her and left anyway. The girl was left alone in the room and thought about what kind of misunderstanding it was and why exactly on the first day here. When she came to her senses a bit, she immediately began to post about where this horrible odor came from. Further carefully, the girl began to look around the room and suddenly saw some strange vase. She walked over to this strange thing and immediately took it in her hands, wondering what it was. It had the same odor coming from it, and she wondered if this was the source of the foul smell that had spread throughout the room. While she was dealing with the whole situation, her daughter approached her. The mom asked what had happened to the girl since she was living it. Coral kept telling her to come here soon to her. And so it has been a full week since the day they moved into the Macaroon mansion since they have been there. Even after the stinking incident, strange things kept happening. By rather strange things, the protagonist means something like ghosts that were flying around the room strangely, or His Majesty's son, who was constantly watching over them and keeping a literal eye on them. But even with all that, one of the biggest problems was the maid, who constantly behaves just disgustingly. And so she was called again, and she angrily wondered why she was called to them. The maid's name is Sarah Chamberlain, and she is a person who has not a shred of decency in her. This maid thinks that the girl, along with her own daughter, doesn't belong here. She didn't have time to take care of it in the first few days after she moved in, but now she has time. That's why she simply will no longer tolerate this kind of treatment to herself, as well as her own daughter. With a satisfied face, the protagonist smiled and pointed her hand towards the exit. At that, she remarked for her to get out of here. The maid looked at her in surprise, and the heroine continued to say that this was why she had called her here. She continued to be in the game room. She didn't ask if she hadn't heard her. She needs to get out first, and then come in normally to see them. The maid didn't like it at all, but she obeyed the protagonist anyway and left the room. After a while, she went back out, and at the same time immediately asked why she had been called. But the heroine was not going to listen to her at all, and so immediately told her to get out. The interlocutor then asked with surprise why she was doing this to her. The heroine looked at her with surprise and asked how it was that she didn't even know why, but she should think hard about it. Further inquired if she wasn't going to leave after all. The maid paused again for a while, and then left the room as the girl had told her to. The heroine was well aware that this was not the first time she had encountered something like this. After a while, she remarked to her to come in. All this she did because she knew that a beast that bared its teeth needed to show them where its place was. Sarah entered the room and immediately asked politely what she could do to help the girl. At that, her hand shook with anger. The heroine smiled because of the situation and remarked for the girl to bring her Kai's education papers. She should also bring the accounting releases of the salaries paid. Her companion looked at her in surprise and wondered why she needed all of this. She remarked that so that the girl would not worry about her son's schooling, she was taking care of the matter. Sarah had always taken care of the wages of the castle workers herself. The heroine began to get closer to her and noticed that she was certainly grateful to her for such hard work. But at the same time, it was not clear what to do next, because now it is not her concern at all. Calypsa angrily remarked that she should bring her all those documents right away. Sarah did not understand what she should do now and started talking about some childish pranks. The heroine smiled at that moment and noticed that she didn't seem to understand anything. It turns out that she must obey those who are above her, and that means that she must obey her. It turns out that if she continues to take too much on herself like this, that it would be better for her to leave this house right now. The maid heard such a rather formidable tone, immediately became very frightened. Immediately afterward, she headed in the other direction and ran out of the room she had been in all this time. The heroine looked at her happily, while exhaling sadly. Macaroon has probably been in the war for too long to worry about and delve into small household chores. That's probably why this sort of thing happened. Of course, the heroine understands everything about this situation, but she doesn't understand why it happened that so many things have accumulated. The girl sat near the stop paper and did not understand what she should even take up. With tears of despair, she sat at her desk and thought that it looked like she would have to do nothing but documentation for a while, even for the sake of Coral's future, and will have to deal with all these documents and organize everything. When the heroine sorted through all these documents a little bit, she suddenly saw a convolution that was a message from someone. This interested her quite a lot, and she immediately read this letter to find out what is there. Because of the information she received, the girl immediately ran to her own daughter's room. Gladly, she rushed in there and addressed the girl. Coral immediately turned her attention to her own mother. With great joy, the girl announced that a letter had arrived about the girl's final enrollment in the Imperial Academy. The little girl rejoiced very much because of this, and together with her mother, they began to dance. After a while, the heroine wondered, but whether Coral was not too happy. Perhaps it so happens that she has a new friend in the academy, which she never told her about. The girl hesitated and noticed that it didn't just happen that way. She then hesitated, and the heroine asked if that was really the case. Next, she added that her mom loves her more than anything in the world after all, and they will live together for the rest of their lives. And that would be just fine, and they would live very happily ever after. The heroine thought she was obviously joking a bit, but her daughter's reaction is so funny. No matter how mature she is, kids her age are still so cute, and she apologizes, of course, but she knows perfectly well. The girl went on to say that she actually loves her mom the most. Suddenly, someone knocked on the locan door, and the heroine thought that someone had come to see Coral. She noticed to enter the room at once. That person who came to the girl turned out to be His Majesty's son named Kai. When the boy stepped inside, this immediately hesitated and turned to Coral. The heroine waved to him and greeted him. Immediately, there was a momentary silence in the room. The heroine took it all in with surprise and thought, what on earth was that all about? Here, an awkward pause occurred between them. She realized that, of course, because of her, his first love turned into a younger sister. Perhaps she should simply show some understanding and walk away. Next, she started heading towards the exit and noticed that her mom had some urgent paperwork to do, so she was leaving. Immediately afterward, she slammed the door behind her, leaving the children alone amongst themselves. The boy turned to Coral and noticed that his notebook was missing. He hesitated a bit and asked if she knew where his notebook might be. The girl immediately went and retrieved his notebook from her desk. As she did so, she noticed that this was his notebook. The interlocutor took it in his hands and began to scrutinize it. Then he asked with surprise if she had really looked at what was written in it. There, he had a rather interesting bookmark, at which he had written his plan for getting rid of his stepmother. It talked about the actions he had already taken, like showering the room with ghost powder or creating a disgusting odor. The boy did not understand what he should do in case Coral saw it all. But the girl in turn looked at him with surprise and asked what it was all about. The interlocutor was embarrassed and remarked that it was nothing special. If she was having trouble keeping up with the material, she could just tell him. The girl remarked that she was grateful for that, and thanks to him, she felt like this semester was going to go pretty well too. Next, the guy turned to leave and remarked that he didn't need anything else, so he would go and they would see each other next time. Then the girl said goodbye to him quite cheerfully and helped him with her hand. But when the boy left the room, her sad face reappeared and she had a droopy look. The protagonist in turn headed to the room, in which a huge stack of papers was waiting for her. After a while, the girl thought that no matter how much she struggled with all this documentation, there was literally no end or edge to it. But even with all of that, she knew that there was nothing she could do to help herself. And all because it had literally become her job ever since she had signed on with Macaroon. When she spoke along with His Majesty, she noticed that before she signed the contract, then she had a request for him. As his daughter-in-law, she also wants him to share some power with her. The interlocutor looked at her in surprise and remarked why on earth she would want all this. Because, as it is, along with power comes a lot of work and also a lot of obligations. The heroine thought it might seem strange because she just looked like she was dodging a contract and now she was asking for something like this. Well, since it did happen, she should do her best to make sure that Kai and Coral don't have to suffer as much as they had to suffer in the affair. She should make sure Kai gets a good education and prepare Kritzel to be handed over to Kai's domain. 2. The moment the girl entered this house, she became the mistress of the castle of Kritzel. If she, as the mistress, doesn't change her duties, it might cause a wave of rumors as well as suspicion about her. That's why she has to do everything quite properly, even if it's only for a short-term contract. From now on, she is still His Majesty's wife, as well as the mother of 2 children. The reason why she insists like this is because she doesn't want Coral to get hurt. She would be better off this way, not only for Coral's future, but also for Kai's future. The heroine thinks back to that very conversation, and she thought she was imagining it, but Macaroon must have smiled after all. The heroine wondered if she had said something funny at that moment because of that. But judging in general, it was just the way she had to do all the hassle. Macaroon would probably enjoy it too after all. Luckily, the girl finally kicks the documents finally was almost sorted out by now. All that was left was to settle a few things regarding Kai's education. She was just going over the documents about the situation. It turns out that they want him to get his basic education in pharmacy rather than general medicine. She wishes Kai wasn't like Macaroon. If Kai is destined to live as a member of the royal pharmaceutical family, that would be fine. But Kai is destined to actually become an emperor. In fact, his regional guy life story was actually full of thorns as well as severe trials. Subsequently, Kai and will prove himself to be a brilliant apothecary on the battlefield. His inability to master even basic ball skills will be the cause of great suffering. But compared to what Coral has endured, it's literally nothing. But do they all really want the girl to watch it with her own eyes? She, of course, mentally apologizes to the boy, because in the world you can't just do what he wants. That's why they need to start with a ball lesson for Kai first, and then talk to Macaroon. But it seems like His Majesty is avoiding her on purpose, because she turns to him and he keeps walking away. Even at lunchtime he's off somewhere, and apparently she'll have to go to him herself. His Majesty was in his study when suddenly he heard someone knocking on the front door, so he turned his attention there and noticed that person leave immediately. Inside entered the main character along with T. The man looked at her with surprise, and wondered why she was doing such a thing. The heroine noticed that making tea is, after all, one of the duties of a wife. It is because of this that it turns out that if they don't want rumors of a sham and marriage to spread everywhere, she has to take care of such little things even. Or, to all this, mine would be better to live in one wing of the mansion. The girl thought that, in any case, if he refused, she would have to be a little more persistent. But suddenly, she looked at His Majesty's face and wondered why he was so uncomfortable like this. The man was quite red at this time and averted his gaze. Trying to smooth things over a bit, he noticed that it looked like the girl didn't come here to say just that. In the end, if there was still something to say to him, then let her say it to everyone now. The heroine realized that her interlocutor really wanted to get straight to the point rather than hesitate, so she gathered her courage and remarked that she would like him to start teaching Kai the art of swordsmanship. The man asked her in surprise, but why would he want to do all that? The girl noticed that usually a boy in their empire would start being taught swordsmanship literally from the age of 7. That's why she wondered if it was time for Kai to learn this art as well. His Majesty apologized to the girl and remarked that he simply does not want to deal with such questions to his own son. He wants the boy to enjoy peace and quiet in their palace, which he created for him, instead of getting involved in the intrigues of noble society. The protagonist was well aware that all those words were a warning not to cross that red line, but she couldn't stop there. That's why she asked His Majesty how he thought this peaceful time would be achieved. In the current world, it's only possible because His Majesty has more power than the first prince. In the end, if the first prince's power becomes stronger than His Majesty's, then will this fragile peace be maintained? The girl was quite aware that the first prince is a rather greedy person. Macaroon must know about it all firsthand, because he had experienced it all firsthand. So he inquired if the girl was saying that Kai needed to learn swordsmanship. The girl remarked that he had indeed understood her perfectly well, and without the accumulation of strength, it is impossible to maintain any peace. And in the end, peace is secured by the one who has the power to keep it standing on top of it all. The man pondered for a while, and then declared that the girl was indeed right. He pondered whether it really worked, for she had prepared an hour-long plan to have a word with him. The interlocutor remarked that despite all this, he had one condition. That condition was that he was only going to start teaching Kai swordsmanship if he himself really wanted to. The heroine thought that he probably wants her to talk the boy into it, but she's not going to force Kai without his consent either. So she remarked that of course she would agree to all those conditions. His Majesty went on to say that it would be quite a challenge. Plus, his own son tends to be cautious, and he's not much for physical activity. The heroine remarked that they would just as soon see what would come of it. The interlocutor asked how she could still be so sure of the success of her scheme. The new wife remarked that she simply believes in it. The man then added, "Is this really coming from a person who has not met Kai?" She remarked that she is like a man who is avoiding her. At the same time, she thinks that the boy still did not recognize her as his own mother. The man thought about it, and after a moment he noticed that everything was fine. He decided that if all this was really true, then if they should organize a family dinner. After a while, they were all already sitting at the table together, and the atmosphere was really tense. The girl didn't understand why all this had happened so suddenly. Calypso Poughton is an egotistical career woman with big ambitions from a family of writers. She married a wealthy man, but he turned out to be a greedy cheater dependent on gambling. In addition, there were rumors that he abused his adopted daughter. At the conclusion of the contract, she was the epitome of his bad reputation. but her reappearance was rather strange. The man didn't understand how this woman's unloved daughter could look this bright. He also wondered if she had really personally drafted this entire document she was holding. And to top it all off, she had asked him to have him teach Kai swordsmanship. In the end, if the girl is still going to leave after a year so unclear, so why would she try so hard like this? All of this really intrigued the man, and because of that, he even smiled occasionally. For a while, they all just sat in silence, and no one even said anything. The heroine was wary and wondered what they were going to do in such an awkward environment. She had absolutely no idea what there was to talk about at the moment. The dishes that were served on the table did differ from person to person. The girl ordered cream soup, and her daughter likes corn soup better because she doesn't like mushrooms. So she was wondering if it was His Majesty who ordered it to be prepared that way. Suddenly the man ranted with, "You haven't tasted the dishes." He then turned directly to Coral and remarked that she should not be shy, for he had ordered her what she liked. That said, he wasn't quite sure if she would like all these dishes. Hearing those words, and for the heroine, it was quite nice, and she thought that this man's care and attention to detail was simply top-notch. But suddenly, the little girl apologized and asked if she could change the soup. Then her mom looked at her in surprise and remarked that she didn't like mushrooms, so was she sure she should change this soup? At that moment, the girl smiled and noticed that now she liked mushrooms after all. The main character wondered why her tastes had changed so suddenly. Suddenly, His Majesty's son turned to the girl and remarked that then they should change. Coral thanked him for that. After a while, she was still served a bowl of mushroom soup and was preparing herself to gobble down a single spoonful. At the same time, it was clearly visible in her that she didn't really want to eat it and was forcing herself through. But despite this, she did eat a spoonful, and His Majesty immediately asked if she liked the soup. The girl immediately squeezed out a smile and said that it was really delicious. The heroine, in turn, saw that the girl did not like this soup at all, and for some reason she ordered it, so she did not understand what was going on. She also looked at the Kai and didn't understand why he was looking at the girl so strangely. She wondered if everyone was still awkward because it was their first family meal. Still, if you really think about that very family detour, this is actually the first time the girl is getting together with everyone for a meal. After all, it turns out that in her previous life she could never have imagined such a thing, and neither could she in this one. So even though family dinners won't happen that often, she wants to remember this moment for a long time. She just wants to leave this moment in her memory for a long time. But suddenly, all her musings were interrupted by the words of a girl who remarked to her brother not to eat with disgust. The heroine immediately paid attention to her and turned to her. The girl's look at that moment was quite strange, and she asked the boy if he was a child, because it all really annoys her. She also added that she was literally ashamed that he was her older brother. The boy at that moment was in shock because of this, as well as the main character. The girl did not understand what all this could mean at all, and why her daughter was behaving like this. Then she turned to her and asked her what had happened to her. After that, she looked at Kai and thought that he could do such a thing that the girl is so angry. And then the heroine turned her attention to His Majesty and wanted him to at least somehow help her in this situation. But the man, in turn, did not say a word about the situation and immediately rose quietly. Unhurriedly, he approached the protagonist and took her hand, and then called her his wife. His gaze was rather strange, and he was embarrassed. At the same time, he noticed that he simply could not take his eyes off her. To say that the protagonist then was shocked, it is nothing to say, because she was simply stunned. His Majesty continued to hold her hand and said that his wife is so delightful that he cannot take his eyes off her. He even feels sad when she looks the other way from him. He looked at the girl very strangely and wondered when she would finally pay attention to him. Because of this whole situation and the word that the man said, the girl was even a little embarrassed. Immediately after that, she took her gaze away from him and thought, what happened to him, because it seems that he somehow went crazy. Although it's Macaroon who's doing all this, but Coral and Buzz are also involved in something. The man was telling the girl where she was looking, and the daughter was saying that her brother was dressed very strangely. The protagonist immediately began to analyze the situation and thought that if you understand everything, the situation was really tense from the beginning of the dinner. That's why she wondered if indeed Kai was really up to all this. The daughter continued talking to the boy and noticed what was wrong with his hair. Did he really think he could look like his brother like that? The heroine listened to all of this carefully and realized that she needed to break them up first. So she turned to her daughter and remarked that they should go into the other room with her mom for a while. But suddenly, His Majesty came up to her and took her by the shoulder. At that, he remarked that they would do something tonight. Then the heroine realized that there was no one in this room, but she would like at least someone to help her. Literally, at that very moment, the door to their room opened and the butler walked in there. He immediately saw the unnatural behavior, His Majesty, and looked at him with surprise. The heroine immediately turned to the butler, did not notice that she was asking for his help. He, of course, immediately agreed to it. The man continued to behave unnaturally. His subordinates asked him to wake up at least for a while. The girl, in turn, approached her daughter and remarked that they should step back. On the way out, she thought that this was the first family meal of her life after all, but it was ruined just like that. After a while, they arrived in the other room and sat together on the bed. Calypso turned to her daughter and asked if she had calmed down now. The girl was a bit confused and remarked that she was calm. Next, the heroine asked if she knew anything about what had happened recently. Coral was quite embarrassed and remarked that Brother Kai had added ice spike medicine to her stepfather's soup. If someone eats an ice spike, they are filled with anger at that particular person and spout harsh words. Sweet medicine for fools, on the other hand, has the properties of making people fall in love. It turns out that the girl added sweetened fool's medicine to the soup. Usually, the target becomes a little prettier, and the target becomes a suitable object that is nearby. The heroine realized that the boy had planned this to separate her and Macaroon, and she should have expected something like this from him. The girl realized that what a truly lovable rascal he was. After a while, His Majesty was also in his room. He had already come to his senses a little, and did not understand how it could have all happened at all. He remembered that his head had started to spin, and so he was behaving unnaturally towards his wife. Suddenly, memories of how he had behaved surfaced in his mind. After that, a butler came in and asked His Majesty if he was all right. The man was sitting rather sad and pensive at the same time, and so he inquired about what had actually happened. The interlocutor immediately noticed that if she was talking about what had happened at lunch, then it looked like potions had been slipped into the food. The man was shocked at this information and thought, what kind of potion? And did this woman really do it? He immediately asked his interlocutor for what purpose she had done it. The man sadly exhaled and remarked to His Majesty that it wasn't the girl who did it, but Mr. Kai. His Majesty asked in surprise if Kai had really done all of this. The butler remarked, standing on Lady Coral, telling them everything. His Majesty asked if he could explain more, for he didn't quite understand the whole situation. His companion remarked that he thought the potion that was put in his food was a spell potion that could make him fall in love with another person. It so happens that they found records of this potion in Kai's notebook. Macaroon noticed that everything was now crystal clear to him. But still, after a moment, he noticed why Kai had done such a thing. The man said that he thought it was because of Miss Coral. The man looked at him in surprise, and the butler went on to say that there are actually some rather interesting rumors going around. They talk about Lady Coral being one of Mr. Kai's loves. Everyone in the academy knew perfectly well about this, and everyone thought of Mr. Kai as the young lady's savior. The man immediately thought that his son was indeed as tenacious as he was. He further inquired as to what Coral thought about the whole situation. The interlocutor remarked that to him, after all, he thought she was in love with Mr. Kai too. They say that Coral is often looked at by young boys, and it seems that Mr. Kai is among their ranks. He's the most persistent of them all, so it didn't go unnoticed. The man was just in shock over this and seemed to be acting rather strangely. The butler went on to say that, of course, Miss Krell seems to be getting along well with Mr. Kai as well. His Majesty, of course, knew very well that his son had fallen in love with the room. It was because of several confirmations. The first one was that Kai had participated in the challenge with folding 100 flowers, and the second was that the boy was making chocolate hearts. It turns out it was Coral after all. Again, the butler asked His Highness if he was really all right. The man looked at him and then stated that his head was indeed a little clearer. The interlocutor there even asked if he meant to say that he wanted to meet his consort again. Hearing this, His Majesty was very much embarrassed, but he didn't answer anything, even very much downcast. The butler then turned around and remarked that he had better go. After some time, it was deep night outside. His Majesty was in one of the rooms brewing some potion for himself. In the process, he was thinking over the situation and what he should do. Whether he should just pretend that he knew nothing and continue to act as he saw fit. But here was the thought cooling in his mind that the contract was for a year, so he had no problem avoiding meetings all that time. Considering that Coral had gotten involved in all of this because of Kai's shenanigans, that option probably wouldn't work anymore. After a moment, he decided it was already settled. It had taken him a day to make the neutralizer, and thanks to that, he was able to forget about everything. But she must enter into reality, very much offended. He felt very sorry for suspecting the main character in all this. It still bothers him that she does not react in any way because of her own character. That's why after a while, he headed to the room where his new wife lived. The man knocked on the door and noticed that he was the one who came to see his wife. Sometime after that, the front door swung open and the main character walked in there. She looked at His Highness with surprise and asked what had happened. The interlocutor was quite embarrassed by the whole situation that happened and averted his gaze. At the same time, he noticed that there had been a huge misunderstanding yesterday. The girl asked with a smirk on her face, but now everything is fine or not? The man sadly remarked that everything was indeed fine now. The heroine said that it was really a pity. She liked his behavior more yesterday, it was more human. His Majesty asked if that was really the case. He immediately wondered if up until now she thought he was a monster after all. The heroine smiled and remarked that it was probably because he was the monster prince everyone was talking about. The interlocutor didn't appreciate this and looked at her angrily. Calypso saw this and immediately stated that it was all just a joke. Either way, she was rather curious as to how Kai was doing now. The man remarked that he must be pretty pissed off right now. The heroine immediately tensed up and wondered if he was punishing him too harshly. The interlocutor remarked that he had absolutely no need to resort to such terrible measures. He must be in great agony right now, somewhere in his room. Kai was indeed in his room and was engaged in some sort of process. He was scrutinizing the things he had in his hands and thinking that this was just awful. He did almost separate his dad and also his new mom, but things got out of hand. Now the guy remembered the angry face of Coral, who said she was very ashamed that he was her brother. The guy didn't understand at all since when she had fallen in love with mushrooms in the first place. She had absolutely no idea that they were ice-spiked soup. It made him sad that even his dad had sugar water soup. The saddest part is that it's been a whole week, and Coral still gets mad when he sees him. That's why he was brewing new potions in his room right now, and he thought it was urgent to make a neutralizer. But despite his best efforts, he didn't understand why he kept failing at it. Then the boy thought about the fact that his dad never realized, probably, that he had given him the soup that had the potion in it. To all that, he was almost cured of all the effects that came after using it. Now the guy was wondering if perhaps he should ask for his help. He pondered this situation, but suddenly realized that he should absolutely not do it. After all, it turns out that if his father found out that he had spiked his potion, he and Coral would be very disappointed in him. But it was completely unclear to him what he was supposed to do now after all. After a while, the boy clicked his way to his father's room. He opened the door and looked carefully to make sure no one was inside. At the same time, he thought that he would have to get the data about the very potion secretly from his dad. After that, he went to the place where the books were and began to scrutinize everything there. After searching for a while, he found nothing and wondered where she had them after all. Then he should have found some information as soon as possible and then simply left. While going through some books, the kid accidentally dropped a leaf and it immediately fell to the ground. Kai was interested in the leaf, immediately paying attention to it. Next, he picked it up in his hands and wondered what it was in the first place. For some time, the boy studied very carefully this document that had fallen into his hands. When he had made a little sense of it, he thought that it could not be. Could it really be that his father had contracted a marriage after all? The next day, His Majesty was in his room looking at books. Suddenly, his door swung open and his son entered, and he immediately turned to him. The man looked at him and asked him what was wrong. At this, he looked at him carefully and thought that, judging by the expression on his face, something bad had happened to him. The boy, for his part, at this time took his gaze downward and noticed that he was the one who had done it all. His father wondered in surprise what he was even talking about now, since nothing was clear. The boy looked him in the eye and noticed that those potions in the food they had ingested, it was he who had put it in. After that, he lost his gaze again and noticed that he will definitely not do that again. He would also obey his mother from now on. The man looked at him and noticed that he was really honest with him, so he forgives him this time. But even still, he must be held accountable for what happened. The boy snickered at that moment and remarked that this was indeed true, and he had already prepared an antidote against these medicines. Today, however, that antidote had already been served on Coral's table. The man thought about this situation and thought that he could not at all change his mind so suddenly. He further inquired from his son as to why he had decided to tell him all this truth. The son simply apologized for the whole thing. At the same time, Kai realized that my mother always approached him first and smiled warmly at him. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that her attention was just a fake and a cheap act. But even with all that, he'd begun to vaguely guess it long before he'd seen the prenup. The same bright smile and kindness impossible to fake that emanated from the new mom. The protagonist in turn continued to be in her room. She literally lay at the table and thought how peaceful it was there after all. The girl recalled that after the incident with the food, Kai and Coral made up, and the boy even brought her flowers as a sign of respect. By all this, even all these internal problems in the manor had long since been resolved. Therefore, the girl wondered if she should go for a walk. After a while, the girl decided that she would do so. So she went out of her room, but suddenly she saw His Majesty there. She looked at him in surprise and asked him what he was doing here and why he did not come to her. The man was rather embarrassed at that moment from noticing that he had come to talk about Kai. He was going to give him a swordsmanship lesson after all, just like his girlfriend had asked him to. The heroine smiled because of that and remarked that it was just fine. His Majesty looked at her rather reaction and then asked how she still managed to convince the boy. The heroine smiled upon hearing this and remarked that it was quite simple. And in reality, it's a pretty simple method. Coral has a few friends that she really likes. Among them, she liked Nero the most because he is so great with a sword. Those were the exact words her mother said for her daughter to say in front of Kai. To His Majesty, she did not confess her secret plan after all, and remarked that it was her trade secret. The man wondered if there was someone she thought would be a good mentor for the boy. It would probably be quite a challenge to find one after the new year. If she finds it difficult, he might be able to help her with that. Hearing this, the heroine thought it looked really awkward, but is the man really trying to be considerate like this? Of course, she is grateful to him for all this care. She smiled further and remarked that it was really all right. She already had one teacher in mind. The interlocutor asked in surprise, but who was it that she was so sure of him? The heroine remarked that this person was Count Knight. Upon hearing this, the man was shocked and wondered if she was really referring to Count Knight, who is the head of the Knight family. He wondered why he should be the one to do so. The girl inarticulately told him nothing at that. But since she knows perfectly the plot of the story she got into, she already had a plan. Knight, master, head of the Knight family, and heir to the ancient ball skill, Knight. Having led the royal order through many battles, he not only became a living legend on the battlefield, but also the owner of numerous nicknames. He was the Mad Master of the Theme on the battlefield, and the only ball master in the Empire. He was also called the Windy Hero of the Century and the Emperor of F2. Though, of course, it's certainly not because anyone longs to see him on the throne. In fact, Count Shufin was the teacher who taught Kai the art of the sword. Thanks to this man's instruction, the guy was able to survive numerous battles on the brink of life and death. And even when Kai became emperor, the man greatly helped him on the battlefield. The protagonist was still unaware of why this man was so devoted to Kai. It turns out that the guy missed the best time for training, and he had to undergo hard and grueling training from Count Shufin. However, what if Kai had received regular swordsmanship training from Shufin from a young age? If they do, the whole see early training and Korean sharp flavor. The results of all of this, of course, would definitely be different from the original. In order that the boy did not have to suffer in the future, Neatly did not have to cry when she sees this. It is definitely necessary to involve Duke Shufin in the training. But the heroine still could not tell all this to His Majesty. That's why she remarked to the man that his skill, fencing, is the best of his sympathy. And if a guy were to start learning swordsmanship, it would be better to do it from the best mentor in the empire. His Majesty coldly remarked that she was unlikely to succeed in all this. The heroine didn't expect to hear words like that. She thought to herself, besides, Duke Shufin had never made a single public appearance since the last time he fought on the battlefield. Even when he became a Lord Knight, he never showed up at the induction ceremony. Everyone was expecting him, but the expectations were in vain, for he also completely failed to show up. Macaroon noticed that it was simply impossible with you so experienced swordmaster as Shufin Knight wanted to teach his son Kai. The girl thought, of course she is part of the right, but why such a reaction is unclear. Perhaps the two have some sort of strained relationship, but the heroine was filled with determination, so she noticed His Majesty not to worry at all. And all of this was because she would personally bring him here. After a while, it was deep night, and the girl walked through the city. She wore a cloak so that no one would recognize her, and so that it would be safer to walk. At last, she reached the place where she was going. She looked carefully at the door, and recognized that this place was definitely here. This is the Empire's leading organization for selling information and contract killings. This organization is called the Moon Guild, and here the heroine entered their building. Literally a short time after talking to Macaroon, the girl found herself right here. This is still the only guild that can provide information about Count Shufin. The heroine tossed a few gold coins to the bartender, and so he escorted her where she needed to go. Unhurriedly, the protagonist headed towards the secret room that was hidden in the place, and his was going there. There was a man there who saw the girl and noticed that she had come to the right place. He also called her name Calypso Patuen. The heroine looked at this man carefully and thought, is this the head of the guild? Still, she probably should have worn a mask before she came here. The interlocutor went on to say that she had gray hair as well as a neat appearance, and it was definitely her. To his knowledge, she is a former self-published author and once divorced. Also, to his knowledge, she is currently married to Prince Macaroon. Bad reputation in the community, rumored, and a badass villain she is. Her height is 7.5 baht, weight 6.15 python, and other body parameters are also known. From such details, the heroine was very surprised and shouted for him to wait for a second. She shouldn't be told all this and let him simply stop. The man took his gaze away from the leaf from which this information was read and asked if something was wrong. In response, the heroine asked if he had gotten this information from nowhere. The head of the guild said that the Moon Guild so increases the confidence of customers before the deal. Or is there something not to like about it? The girl looked at him in amazement and wondered how he managed to know everything, because he looks like some kind of villain. After that, she noticed that everything was indeed true. She asked if they always asked their clients to come in person. The interlocutor remarked that of course they do, but only for important information. Immediately afterwards, the interviewee put down the dots with the information and looked at the girl. At that, he inquired why she was looking for Shufin after all. The heroine was a little wary and asked if they even needed to talk about all this. The interlocutor stated that the payment for important information is indeed information. The girl thought for a while about what to say and stated that she was looking for a swordsmanship tutor for her son. The guild leader looked at her in surprise and asked her what she had just said. After that, a bright smile appeared on the man's face, and he asked if she really wanted to entrust the boy's education to a bully like Shufin. The heroine averted her gaze from him and angrily remarked that he had nothing to worry about after all. The guild leader smiled and remarked that it wasn't even her son, so why was the magazine worried about him like that? He wondered if he understood correctly that it was just a sham marriage. The protagonist looked at him in surprise and wondered if he had found out about their marriage contract. But the interlocutor remarked, did he understand correctly, that this was the way the upper aristocracy usually acted? The man started laughing loudly and asked if he understood correctly. The heroine hesitated a little and remarked that she could not be told that this was far from the real state of affairs. At the same time, she thought that perhaps she was worrying too much. The interlocutor further inquired again, but why exactly did she need Shufin? The girl thought for a while, and then she remarked that there were no more swordsmen as skillful as Shufin in the Empire. And was she wrong now? The guild leader had said that those as skillful as Shufin could not really be found anywhere else. The girl looked at him in astonishment and thought that it was all idle chatter. Didn't the other guilds have any information too, after all? She then said that if she had told all the information she had, to then let him give her the information about Shufin. The leader then remarked that she could go home and he would give her the full information a little later. The girl asked in surprise how it was to return and how it was that he was going to give it to her. To all this, she did not understand at all, then why he had summoned her here in general. The ringleader said that it was really simple, because such information should be evaluated by looking at the person. The protagonist remarked that it was really astonishing because the guild discriminated against other people. She asked if money doesn't decide everything. The interlocutor still asked if the girl could stop treating the Moon Guild the same way she would treat other guilds. In any case, let her take it easy and return to her home, and in a very short time, he would contact her. After a while, the protagonist left the Moon Guild, and a subordinate walked in to the leader. He turned to the boss and noticed that he sent him away, but why he did it, if the customer could see him. The man in turn remarked that he just wanted to see what kind of girl this was. The subordinate further asked, so why did the customer cease to see him after all? The subordinate remarked that he had said it before, that it was all for nothing. The interlocutor noticed that if you judge correctly, this had never happened before. Still, the woman was a stunning beauty, but could it be that he had decided to end the affair? The ringleader remarked that there was no way he was going to end it, and he could handle it himself, so let the man keep his hands off the case. The subordinate was surprised and asked if he was sure about all this. Is the man really going to give information to this girl about Duke Shufin? The man looked at him and asked if there was any problem with that. Because of that, the guy stated, doesn't he know that Duke Shufin has a rather bad temper after all? If he found out that they had passed on information about him, it was even scary to think of the consequences that could await them. Hopefully, he wondered if the head would not interfere in this matter. Let it be a contract, of course, but at the moment, she was still his wife. The man asked in surprise, well, what should he understand from this information? The interlocutor shouted out that this girl is Macaroon's wife after all. If he interferes in all these matters again, he might not be able to pick his bones then, said the boss, and noticed that if the subordinate is going to continue to carry on this kind of nonsense, then let him simply leave. The guy remarked that this cannot be. For a long time he did not have a lover, and now even a married woman is trying to win. The ringleader stated that he was an idiot. After a while, the protagonist received information, and it was a rather large package. She opened it and wondered with amazement what it even was. The advantages of Shuan Knight were written there. He has an incredibly handsome face, as well as an attractive figure. He also has a brilliant skill in sword fighting, and all the other data was also in this roll-up. The surgeon wondered if she had mistaken the report and got the information from Shufin Knight's fans, since this volume was just huge. After a while, she finally found some useful information for herself. It was written there that the only disadvantage of Shufin is a diagonal scar on his face 20 centimeters long. When it comes to perceiving a person, weaknesses naturally have a greater impact than strengths, and the heroine has the perfect means to hide Count Shufin's weakness after all. Now the girl did not understand how she could have forgotten that she was an excellent master of makeup. After a while, she went to the table and took ink to write a message. And she was writing to Duke Shufin that she only needed him for 30 minutes, and if he was interested, have him contact her. The message may seem too short, but the key is still the call. It was important that it be a short hook to get Count Shufin interested. After a while, a reply to her letter came, and he wrote whether she was seducing him, but if so, it was not enough. The heroine then thought he had taken the bait after all. This is, after all, a man that hid his tracks for a whole 10 years. It was because of this that the girl was nervous about sending her own letter. It was certainly a lot more amusing than she had thought before. After that, she thought that if he did decide to play with her, she would try the real temptation. In his next message, he wrote that she wanted to offer him a changer for an hour. It didn't take long for the interlocutor to reply, and the girl received it soon after. The man wrote that it seemed that she had actually succeeded, but what were the terms of the deal? With surprise, the heroine read this message and thought, is it really all so simple? Although perhaps the interlocutor simply did not understand the essence of the matter. Then she began to think how to formulate all these conditions so that he understood the essence of the case. She thought, perhaps she should write that there is a child who admires his great skill, and she asks to become his teacher. But that option didn't work, and she thought that was awfully cute. The second option was that his touch would save one child, but she rejected that too, because it was absurd. Then she thought she should write that if His Majesty had time, she would at least have a body to talk to him. But at the same time, she thought, what a prank after all. She ended up writing that she would like the Grand Master to be a swordsmanship teacher for her child. She thought it would probably be a bit strange, but let her be simply honest with him. After a while, a reply to this letter came after all. The man wondered where he was supposed to go. This made the heroine shocked and thought it was getting kind of awkward. Apparently, he is clearly not as easy a person as she thought. This time, the heroine offered him a changer for one day, then wrote that it's Cradle Law 2 building of the Macaroon family's magnificent Calypso Manor. Have him come there and then ask for Calypso. In response, the man wrote back that he understood and would come tomorrow. The protagonist told the prince about it. He asked with surprise if Count Schufen Knight would really come today. The girl remarked that he understood everything correctly. Then the interlocutor said that although they had not arranged to meet, he never came. In the end, it seems that there was some misunderstanding after all. But suddenly a butler came up to them and addressed His Highness. They turned their attention to the guy, and the guy noticed that Count Schufen Knight had come after all. Everyone present in the building as well as everyone outside turned their attention to the front door. The beautiful Count had indeed entered there, and he greeted His Highness and remarked that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. After a while, His Highness the Count, as well as the protagonist, were sitting at the table drinking tea. Schufen smiled and remarked that it was a pleasure to meet him. At that very moment, the game thought he had been on the battlefield for a long time, so she imagined him to be a sharper person. Even so, it seems that aristocrats always remain aristocrats. As a consequence, the heroine also introduced herself and remarked that her name was Calypso, and she was the one who had written him the letter. Then the man smiled and noticed that she was even more beautiful than he had thought before. The heroine was very much embarrassed and thought that it was a rather unexpected compliment. At the same time, she did not understand at all what she should answer to it now. She thought for a while and then smiled back as well. In doing so, she declared that he really had a good sense, as her beauty had never been a secret. The prince looked at her very strangely because of these words, and the count in his turn turned away and laughed a little. At the same time, the girl noticed that the count's nobility also looked fine, as all people talk about him. The interlocutor thanked for the compliment, and there was quite a cordial atmosphere between them. But here was His Highness not liking it all at all, and he looked at them strangely. Then he lowered his bend. They all noticed that they weren't going to exchange compliments when they came here after all. The count inquired, but could they get right down to business now? The girl remarked, of course, let him speak freely what he was thinking. Then the man stated that they must know that learning fencing takes a great deal of time. And because of that, it comes out that it is better to save each other's time after all. That's why it looks like he'll have to stay here for a while. The heroine looked at him and thought that Schufen was actually taking the training of new students quite seriously. She, in turn, thought that he would put up tougher terms and was glad to find that this was absolutely not the case. With a smile on her face, the girl remarked that if this all really helped, she would be very grateful to him. After that, she looked at her husband and asked if that was the case. The man sat with a rather menacing face and remarked that perhaps it was. The heroine looked at him carefully and wondered why he was always reacting to Schufen like this. After all, how could she know during her time at the academy? They were close friends. At the same moment, the Count noticed that considering that Kai's swordsmanship training started later than usual, he would need a lot of time to train him himself. So he would be spending most of his time with him, excluding sleeping time, of course. The prince in turn inquired, but why would he put so much effort into it? The interlocutor smiled and remarked that it was the Guy Knight's method of training. There was some strange atmosphere in the room, and it was really obvious that there was some tension between them. The heroine looked at it and felt as if she was being burned by a fire when she was around them and when they were talking by a friend. But she didn't understand why it was like that. After that, she decided that she needed to calm them both down somehow. She looked at her husband, and to him she remarked that he probably knows better than anyone what respect Count Shufin deserves as the leading swordsman in the empire. That was why she was asking the man to take the matter entirely upon himself. Macaroon didn't reply anything to this and simply looked at his wife sadly. Immediately afterward, he rose. The girl in turn wondered, but what about the Count's shelter? Probably he would be more comfortable in the eastern wing. The man in turn headed toward the exit and remarked that it was his wife's business. The heroine looked at him in surprise and asked him where he was going now. His Majesty, he remarked, thought his help would be of no use anyway, and he could not continue the conversation without him. Immediately afterward, he remarked that the East Wing was absolutely unsuitable. After saying that, he immediately closed the door behind him and slammed even with it. The protagonist was left alone together with the Count to discuss things further. After that, Shufin smiled and remarked that it seems that you two don't get along perfectly. The heroine was surprised by this information and asked if he really thought so. The man further remarked that, thinking back to where he lived, it would be more convenient for him to live close to Kai. The heroine asked, but why is that so? Don't knights usually prefer to live near the training ground? The Count remarked that it seemed to him that living in the same space as his apprentice would be more efficient in terms of training. The girl, for her part, thought why not with Kai? After all, she didn't realize if she had mentioned Kai's name in common in the letter. At the same time, she wondered if things were actually going too easily, and if it was all suspicious. But still, stated to the interlocutor that then she would prepare him to rest there. And so it came to pass that a week after Count Shufin's stay for the whole week, the girl watched him. To her, he looked like some sort of rogue, but except for his excessive Spartan teaching, nothing much was going on. Still, it seemed to the heroine that he had some ulterior motives towards the affair. Suddenly, her own daughter came up to her and turned to her mother. She had a cake in her hands and asked if she could take that and bring it to Kai's practice. At the same time, the mom smiled and remarked that of course she could do that. She suggested that they bring Kai something yummy since he had been working and practicing so much lately. The girl was very happy about this event. The boy, in turn, was on the training ground with his teacher Earl. The boy was holding a ball in his hands, and the man noticed that he was leaning forward too much now. That's why they should start all over again. Then the boy was selling his training and swinging the ball towards the training pole. The heroine saw the whole situation and thought he was really awfully strict about training. The last time she saw Kai, he had sweaty palms, but he was completing tasks without any protest, and that's impressive. The heroine, along with her daughter, positioned themselves near the training area. The mom turned to her daughter and remarked if she thought the one with the ball looked cooler than Nero. Coral remarked that she did, which meant he would be in the sword fencing tournament as well. The girl remarked with a smile on her face that of course that was true. While thinking that of course she intended to say all of this so that Kai could hear it all. And the boy, for his part, did hear it all and listened very carefully. The girl turned to her mother again and wondered what would happen if Kai could defeat Nero. The heroine patted her on the head and remarked that of course he could do it, for he would do quite well with Teacher Shufin. While he wasn't chatting, it was the Count who approached them and noticed what a curious conversation they were having here. The girl turned her attention to the man and saw that Shufin was there. The heroine immediately smiled and greeted the man in front of her. While doing so, she carefully looked at his face and thought that he was actually more handsome than Macaroon. Kai also ran up to them, wiping his hands, and happily asked if it was strawberry cake. The heroine asked if he liked this cake because she had specially made it for him because he was practicing so hard. After that, she wished the children a pleasant appetite. and they happily began to eat all the sweets they had there. Next, the heroine turned to the Count and remarked that he should also treat himself while doing so. He, with a smile on his face, thanked her for such hospitality and started eating too. After that, together they sat and enjoyed the pastries that the protagonist had prepared. After a while, the boy turned to Coral and asked if she really wanted to see him practicing. The girl remarked that she really wanted to. The boy then remarked pathetically that she would be surprised when she saw all his skills. The daughter then approached her mom and asked if she could watch Kai practice. Mom smiled and remarked that of course she could do that. After that, the children walked together to the practice area. The heroine carefully looked at the children and thought why they were so beautiful, and she thought they were quite cute. But suddenly, while she was looking at them, who paid special attention to the Count, he had been sitting next to her the whole time, and for some reason was looking at her sweetly. At the same time, his gaze was somehow quite interesting, and he was literally admiring her. The heroine thought that usually in such situations, people walk away and feel awkward. The girl didn't understand at all why the man kept looking at her, making the situation more and more uncomfortable. She wondered if he had something to say to her at this point. And so, with Yu diffusing the situation a bit, the girl wondered if it was true that Kai had a talent for martial arts. Hearing this, the interlocutor remarked that he thought the boy could be on Macaroon's level. The girl wondered if that meant it wasn't such a great talent. Shufin remarked that the latter's talent couldn't compare to the former's. The heroine thought that if there was a Macaroon here after all, he would be saying something very different, wouldn't he? At that, she inquired, "But who is the first?" The interlocutor looked at her and asked if she didn't know who she had hired in the first place, since he was right next to her. After these words, the heroine immediately turned away from him and could barely contain her laughter. But still, a little he was getting through. The interlocutor was embarrassed and asked why she was laughing, whether she did not believe him. The girl continued to hold back her laughter and remarked that of course it was all wrong. She remarked that she absolutely believes him, so she asks that he please take care of Kai. The man looked at her for a moment as he pondered these words. Immediately after that, he noticed that the girl should know the fact that Macaroon, as well as his son Kai, seemed to be very different people. The heroine looked at him with surprise and asked why they are different. Shufin asked if the girl had ever noticed any of Kai's other talents. The girl asked what other talents were we talking about now. The interlocutor remarked that he was talking about magic, for example, or healing abilities. The girl immediately thought about magic and healing abilities. Remembering the plot of Ravian Rose, she knew that there were indeed supernatural powers such as magic or sacred energy. However, such abilities were usually inherited from family members, or were innate talents passed down in royal families from generation to generation. Kai probably only mastered the magic that was passed down to him by Macaroon, as the girl can understand. After some time after thinking about it, the heroine noticed that she was certainly not sure, but unfortunately, it seems that he does not have such talents. But it was unclear to her why that was so. Suddenly, she turned her attention to the man, and the man began to rise. He noticed that he had been chilling for too long, so it was time for him to continue his training. The girl remarked that it was getting rather late, and whether they were interfering with this workout. The interlocutor remarked that it was all right, because rest was also very important. At this time, His Majesty the Prince stood near the window and listened to what they were chatting about. The man was thinking about what was happening right in front of his eyes. He didn't understand what kind of relationship there could be between these two. He also wondered what kind of game Shufin was playing right now. It was unclear to the man why things were happening like this, since Shufin had outright rejected Lena Creed's request to train Will, but suddenly agreed to train his son Kai. In fact, the game flatly rejected that very offer, but suddenly wanted to be Kai's mentor, and it's completely illogical. Even for Shufei, meeting the man must have been quite awkward. And since it went pretty normally, that means he has something to do with Calypso after all. While His Majesty was pondering over this situation, then suddenly his subordinate came over and remarked that he had found something. The prince stated that he had asked him to find out all the details about Shufin. The butler remarked that it was already tomorrow that the shadows of Kraid would be coming. To all this, there was one more thing he owed him to tell him. The man glanced at him and remarked on telling him things as they were. The interlocutor noticed that the wounds on Mr. Kai's arm still couldn't heal in any way. His Majesty asked, but why this was happening. The subordinate stated that it was indeed a bit strange that the wound, which should have ignited long ago, was only getting worse. Macaroon asked if it was possible that someone was using something to keep it from healing. The interlocutor remarked with sadness on his face that he fears so. In fact, it is. Lately, the lady has been coming into Mr. Kai's room every morning. The man inquired and what he wanted to say with all this. He wondered if he was claiming that she wanted to do something to Mr. Kai. The subordinate remarked that that might not be the case, but he was still concerned about that fact. That's why he just says just in case. It's for him now. Macaroon remarked that he would check it out personally today then. While they were chatting amongst themselves, there was a maid in the room who heard the whole conversation perfectly. She was casually trying to pick up the dirty dishes that His Majesty had left behind, but she listened attentively to the conversation. After a while, she picked up all the dishes and left the prince's room. When she moved away from it a little, it immediately stopped and turned her attention to the side. The reason she stopped was because she saw the other maids chatting amongst themselves off to the side. One of them remarked to the other that Madame had been looking for ointment a few days ago. The companion noticed that this time Mr. Kai had injured his arm. The first girl noticed, so she must be simply going to help the boy. The other maid remarked that that must be the case, and it turns out that Madame is really a very kind woman. Sarah Chamberlain really heard all this perfectly well and thought that she could not believe that this fool was so kind. Suddenly, the girl remembered the words that His Majesty would today personally test the theory that her butler had told him. She already had an evil plot spinning in her head, and she thought that if it was used correctly, then maybe she could slap that woman. At night, the protagonist stood outside the front door to Kai's room. Her hand was ointment. She thought that this boy, even when his hand is in the most horrible condition, is still showing off in front of Coral. Even if she wanted to put ointment on his wound, she would run away. So the girl thought that tonight she should make it a secret. Suddenly, she looked at the very ointment she had in her hands and thought, what is it? It's definitely not the ointment she usually uses, and did the maid bring some new ointment? While the girl was looking at it, His Majesty the Prince secretly appeared behind her back. He leisurely began to approach the girl from behind and then grabbed her hand and turned her toward him. The protagonist was frightened and then saw that it was Macaroon and thought that he had forgotten her at all. It was because of this that she wondered what the man was doing here. Her interlocutor's face had a rather angry look on it, and he remarked that it should be her. He was asking what she was doing here. The prince continued to hold the girl's hand and asked her where it came from. The heroine realized she was in a predicament, but asked what the man was talking about. The interlocutor again remarked in a rather angry tone that he was asking where she got the ointment from. The girl didn't understand what it was or why he was attacking her so suddenly. She noticed the man remove his hand first before he spoke to her. As she did so, she remembered the way it was in the story, and the man asking why Kai and not him. The protagonist understood what he was saying and guessed what the macaron might suspect her of, so she should explain herself. The prince continued to not let go of her hand and noticed that he was really disappointed in her. With a sadness in his voice, he remarked whether all this time was really just a pretense on her part. The heroine, in turn, noticed that he was really very kind. The man was very angry and remarked that she could test all this kindness on herself. Then, even the girl held out her hand and noticed him to do what he wanted. Immediately after that, she turned around and headed to walk away from him. On the way, she wondered why all of this had happened like this. She realized, of course, that if she had heard such words before, she would definitely be angry. But right now, for some reason, she felt very sad, and she couldn't contain herself at that moment. After that, the prince was left alone with only his thoughts, for the girl had left. He took the very ointment and thought that at some point he really felt intention. After some place, he came to his place where his laboratory was and different flasks with liquids. The man had thoughts in his mind. Could Calypso really be a spy for Rainer Creed? Still, he tried to push those thoughts away from him and not think about it. Macaroon realized that reality was not too late to check things out, and they could find out if Kai had been poisoned by doing an examination. Immediately after that, He started using the liquid from his flasks in order to test this. In doing so, the man wondered if Calypso could really be at fault. She had a tremendous amount of effort as well as her senses, and it was hard to believe that it was all a lie. Oh, he hoped to let it be just a simple misunderstanding caused by his overcautiousness as well. But after a while, he saw the reaction to his actions in the flask and thought it was a curse. After a while, it was already morning. Kai woke up in his bed and was a bit shocked, for he saw that the man was in his room. He looked at him with surprise and also turned to his father. He wondered what the man was doing in his room at this hour. His father answered nothing to this and inquired if his hands were all right. The boy noticed that they were still a little sore. This made the man feel sad, and he immediately apologized for needing to be more careful. His son wanted to say something to him, but his father went on to say that he thought the reason his arm was getting worse was because of his new mom, and he didn't even know about it after all. Kai was very surprised to hear those words and asked what the hell he was even talking about now. The prince stood up and stated that he was very sorry for scaring him, also hoped that he could fix it quickly. He then headed for the exit, but his son stopped him, shouting for him to wait, as it was definitely impossible. Macaroon turned back to him and remarked that he knew he was having a hard time believing it all. Even so, he had seen him walking to his room yesterday, holding the poison in his hands. The boy, for his part, stated that this was absolutely not true. In fact, he knew it all perfectly well. The man asked in surprise what he meant now. Then the boy noticed that every night a new mother came to put ointment on his wound. He, in turn, pretended to be asleep, because he felt very uncomfortable when she did all this. He even personally confirmed that it was normal ointment. But suddenly the man says that it was poison, and that is simply not possible, as he actually self-certified it. The father was shocked because of this and looked at the guy's hand, which had uncharacteristic wounds. Because of the shape of the wound he saw on the boy's arm, he thought it was unlikely that it was poison if the wound didn't have the typical shape for it, which all meant that it was someone else and not poison that caused this injury. Then the man remarked to his son that he smelled everything perfectly fine. If he still insisted on it, they would do another investigation into the matter. The boy got excited and remarked that this was what he wanted. On the morning of the main game, I had a rather sad look on my face as well. She realized that because of some vague sadness, she greeted the morning with puffy eyes. To all this, it turns out that all her efforts so far had been simply futile. For her part, she didn't ask anything in particular, but she didn't want to be treated so dismissively. On the way out, she thought that perhaps she was, and perhaps to Macaroon, she was merely the object of a contract. As the girl passed near the building, she was approached by a man. Us immediately turned her attention to him and saw that Count Schufen was there. He looked at her and asked where she was going with her thoughts. The heroine turned to him and the interlocutor inquired, or was she simply walking here? Calypso asked him if he was getting ready for his morning workout now. The interlocutor remarked that he was. He had been waiting for Kai all along. At this, he looked at his interlocutor carefully and saw that there was something wrong with her. He further walked closer to her and noticed that when she did give him his pager, Calypso remarked that she had completely forgotten about it and would now bring it gladly. The man then excitedly inquired as to how many days she would give it back after all. The heroine smiled and remarked that she would probably give it for a whole month after all. Schufen, upon hearing this, stated that it seemed his credit rating had actually increased quite nicely. The heroine only smiled upon hearing this. But just a few moments later, she changed her face and her face became rather sad. The man noticed this and said that he saw his joke did not work at all, and it seems that she really had something going on. The girl lowered her eyes sadly and remarked that it was all, in fact, because Kai had injured her arm. After that, she thought about it for a while and noticed that it wasn't anything serious. The Count noticed because of this that it wasn't all that, as she looked like it definitely wasn't all right. So he inquired if all this had come about because of Macaroon. The girl looked at him then with surprise, and the interlocutor stated that he was definitely wrong after all. The heroine looked at him even more surprised and noticed that she did not say anything, so she does not understand how he realized it. The Count stated, "It's all because Miss Calypso can do no wrong. The heroine was even embarrassed because of these words and thought that it was all very strange indeed. After all, her husband, Prince Macaroon, had always thought she was a spy or just some outsider. But here was Shufin immediately saw something good in her. The girl's musings were interrupted by a man who noticed that she was actually smiling so beautifully. The girl asked in surprise what he meant by that. The Count in turn added that she was simply smiling, as she always does. Then the girl was embarrassed and her cheeks immediately flushed, but she thanked him for his warm words. She noticed that his words really comforted her, even if it was just a joke. The interlocutor, in turn, was also embarrassed about it, because he liked the smile quite a lot. After a while, Kai came in and immediately apologized for the delay. The teacher stated to him that everything was really all right, but what was wrong with his arm? The boy remarked that it wasn't anything serious, and so he shouldn't worry about it. The Count remarked that there was nothing that could be done if he had already hurt himself after all. He would not focus on training today. He further asked his boy, walking closer to him. He walked over to him and immediately drew his weapon. A moment later, the man picked up his sword and some strange energy emanated from it. He felt it, and then smiled and wondered if it was true after all. His Majesty the Prince was in his room at the same time, looking out the window. He was thinking about the situation that was happening to his son and wondering what he should do. But suddenly, a butler burst into the room he was in and immediately addressed His Highness. He was in a great hurry. The man saw this and immediately inquired what was the matter. The interlocutor hastily remarked that they had found the real culprit after all, who had injured Mr. Kaya's hands. The man's face changed with a tear and remarked to bring that culprit here. After a while, one of the subordinate knights brought this man to him. He then stated that this was the very culprit, and the butler stated that this man had cast a spell, gradually worsening the condition of Kaya's body. And in an attempt to cause him irreparable harm, he had pulled it all off. His Majesty looked angrily at this suspect and wondered how dare he even try to harm his family. He further asked for the person to tell him who was behind it. That very suspect didn't say anything, and the knight that was standing next to him remarked for him to speak up, quickly, before it was too late. But the old man still said nothing, and the prince remarked that he understood then. With a rather cold look, he remarked that if they took him into custody and interrogated him, he would certainly tell them everything. It turns out that they did so, and the man was taken into custody. The prince went back to his room and sat down at his desk. He pondered the situation on the way, and as he sat down, he wondered if it was Reiner Kreith who was behind the whole affair. Even if he is incredibly greedy, is he really that bold to roll out something like this? Yet Kai is getting ticked off. Just a few moments later, the man stopped and thought he had something else to think about. He remembered that very situation with the Calypso and wondered if this man wanted to blame his wife. He was very angry about the situation and thought that he should immediately find out who was behind it. After all, it turns out that he had already begun to suspect his wife, even though she wasn't even guilty of anything. Because of this, His Majesty the Prince decided that he needed to go personally and interrogate the suspect. That was why he had already headed downstairs to the cell where that very old man was sitting. When the man went downstairs, there he saw a guard who ran up to him and began to apologize immediately. The man looked at him in surprise, and then inquired what the noise was all about. The interlocutor sadly remarked that it was during the guard's shift change at the workplace that it happened. The prisoner, who was suspected of all these atrocities, had taken his own life. The man was surprised and immediately approached the man. He took a close look at his body and thought that if he even went so far as to kill himself, it meant that there was actually a pretty big player behind everything. This was precisely the reason why he realized that he needed to further investigate the recent incident for now. After a while, a butler was in His Majesty's room and apologized to him. He remarked that he should have actually had better control of the situation with this man. The prince in turn remarked that it was all in the past and they would be restricting access to the estate to outside individuals for a while. It would also come out that if any servants were found, someone suspicious, let's say, would immediately report it. He remarked that we should be investigated more evenly by the keepers of the weapons. The butler said that he understood perfectly well, and that Creed's shadows had long since arrived. His Majesty asked if the shadows had any information about Shufin. The interlocutor, in turn, stated that there had recently been a rumor that contacts between the people of the Sacred Kingdom as well as Count Shufin had become more frequent. Hearing this, the man was immediately wary. At the same time, he of course recalled that it was there on the brink of life and death during the last war that he had come to his senses. Back then, someone had brought him bleeding from the monster attack to the Sacred Realm. Whether or not it was Shufin who sheltered him with the Sacred Realm after all. Although if one actually thinks of it that way, it's unlikely. After all, it turns out that in the last war, Shufin had left the gorge together with Kraid. That's why the man didn't understand why the Count was contacting the Sacred Realm again back then. Suddenly, the subordinate noticed that there was one more thing that he should definitely inform him. The prince noticed to tell him. The subordinate stated that this information about the culprit in this case also came from Count Shufin. The prince remarked, "So then, that's how it was all. Everything turns out to be intertwined: the criminal who committed suicide, the Shufin Sacred Kingdom, as well as Kai. If you look at it that way, the situation is getting more and more complicated." He also noticed that he should apologize to his own wife after all anyway. At this moment, he was quite sad-looking, and also he had some sealed letter on his desk. At this very moment, the heroine was in her room, but she had to go out, so she opened the door to go out. But when she got out a little, she turned her attention to the side. There, she saw His Majesty the Prince, who stood waiting for her. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if it was Macaroon. The man only wanted to turn around in her direction to look, but the girl closed the door to the room immediately behind her. As she did so, she was rather tense and wondered what this man was doing here. Had he really come to apologize to her for the situation that had happened? So it turns out that he had accused her of something she hadn't done, and now he had come here. If he still wanted to say something, he should have waited for her here instead of going in there. The heroine's interest in this awoke, and she immediately opened the door to see if the man was there. But when she opened the door, she could not believe her eyes, for he was still here. But she did not understand why that was so. At the same time, she wondered how long His Majesty was going to wait for her. And then the girl decided that she had to act after all, and so she left the room. She turned to the man and wondered if he had something to say to her. He remained silent for his part, and lowered his gaze downward. He wasn't looking at her at all, and he was embarrassed at that. He also hesitated a bit and then apologized to the girl. He remarked that he wanted to apologize for the situation that had come between them. When he said all these words, he immediately held out an envelope that was sealed and was in his hand. The heroine looked at him with surprise and asked what it was. The man handed it to the girl and remarked that he would like her to read it. Immediately after he handed over this message, he turned around to walk away from her. And the main character was interested in it, and she wondered if he really wanted her to read it. Right away, she started reading, and on the very first page it said that it was an appeal to dear Lady Calypso. The man wrote that he had made an irreparable mistake towards her and could not forgive him. But he will still try his best to earn her forgiveness. He apologizes again and thanks her, and at the bottom was Macaroon Creed's signature. The heroine was surprised and wondered if he had really written her a letter of apology. Suddenly, she looked in that very envelope and saw that there was another letter in there. It said it was an apology, and it was written by Kai. He wrote that he didn't do it because he hated Mom. He is sorry that he messed up and was very rude to her. He would behave much better in the future. The girl thought it was actually very nice, and so she was embarrassed even. It was a handwritten letter after all, and she was grateful that he had come to her first. In any case, it's already quite lovely. After a while, the sleepy protagonist came to the hall they were supposed to be eating in. She entered and was there first, but when she looked at the table, you saw that there is a very huge amount of food. Looking carefully at what was there, the girl thought what had happened to the breakfast menu. Is it all organized by His Majesty the Prince? But it absolutely still does not look like him. Suddenly, a boy entered the room and immediately apologized to the heroine. He stood on the way out with a downcast look, and the girl inquired what was the matter with him. The boy apologized again and remarked that it would definitely not happen again. Immediately afterward, he was embarrassed, and then remarked that he was grateful to her for all that help. In doing so, he even called her Mom. The heroine from this embarrassment today expected the boy to approach her with an apology. After that, she went up to him and stroked his head. She still thought that he was asleep and would not notice the fact that she would be applying the ointment to him. But now the girl was happy because of the fact that she was appreciated after all, and everyone apologized to her for that situation. Also, her daughter came to the table as well, and so the girl noticed how about breakfast after all. Suddenly, Coral looked at the empty chair that was in front and asked what about her father. The main character was a little embarrassed about this and thought for a moment. Immediately afterward, she turned to the children and remarked that it looked like he was so busy that they should eat together. The children looked at her and then looked at each other, pondering the whole situation. After a while together, they were walking in the garden, and now they were sitting on some bench. The girl asked if this was unhappily strange after all. The boy stated that indeed it was, they must have had a fight after all. After that, he wanted to add something else, but suddenly fell silent. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked him what was wrong. Trying to pretend that nothing had happened, the girl said that nothing had happened. Next, she turned to Coral and noticed that there was something else. The girl remarked for him to speak already, but the boy continued to ramble that it was just his assumption small. Because of this, Coral noticed for him to already say quickly what he had been thinking about all this time. The boy lowered his own and asked who the girl would live with if mom and dad got divorced. Coral looked at him in surprise and asked what else he meant by divorced. Did he really know any information about them wanting a divorce? Kai was immediately wary and remarked that he had just recently said it was all just that, assumed. The girl started to get tears in her eyes, and she noticed that he wasn't just asking that. So she wondered if they had really had a fight. The kid noticed that they really weren't, and thought that it wasn't like he could tell Coral about the prenup. He then stated that they should then bring them closer together better. The girl asked in surprise, but how would they do that? Kai then leaned closer to her and remarked that if she was talking about it, she would tell her now. Immediately after that, he started whispering in the girl's ear the plan he had thought of before. After a while, the protagonist sat in her room and quietly drank tea. Suddenly, the front door to her room opened and her daughter walked in. With joy on her face and with a toy in her hands, she greeted her mother. The heroine immediately got up and greeted Coral as well, and then asked if she liked the academy. The girl smiled and remarked that she did enjoy it. Papa had even sent a beautiful carriage for her today. Calypso smiled and remarked if that was really true. At that, she thought that His Majesty must be trying to win Coral's heart again. After all, he had even escorted her out this morning. At that, she turned her attention to the toy the girl was holding. Pointing at it with her hand, she wondered where the girl had gotten this toy she was holding. The little girl with a smile on her face remarked that her daddy had given it to her. She then picked it up and showed it to her, noticing that she had made her clothes, and further inquired if she was really beautiful in reality. The heroine stated with joy on her face that it was indeed beautiful and amazing that she had made the clothes herself. At the same time, it seemed quite cute for the heroine, and she thought it was her beautiful daughter. And in the future, she would simply open a store of magical clothes. At the same time, the heroine realized that there can be absolutely no mistake, and she is familiar with the attack. She is simply sure that she saw her at a secret auction. This very doll, held by her daughter, is very difficult to find even in the entire empire. Given the timing of the auction, he must have bought it long before the ointment incident. The heroine has no choice but to express her gratitude to Macaroon in this regard. He may not be a very good husband that way, of course, but he's actually a great father. Suddenly, the daughter turned around and turned to her mother. The girl inquired as to what she wanted from her. The girl, with enthusiasm in her eyes, inquired what kind of men she liked after all. Then Calypso looked at her with surprise, for she had not expected such a question from the girl. At the same time, she thought that, of course, she was the one who should have asked such a question, and the little girl suddenly asked her such a thing, and she felt very uncomfortable about it. Immediately, she thought about this question and started rambling on about the person she liked. He noticed that it was a man, reserved and naive, but depending on the situation, quite seductive, with a handsome face and a well-built body. Something like that. The girl asked in surprise what her mom meant by all those words. The heroine remarked that she would be sure to understand her, and these all words, when she grew up a little. That's when Coral wondered, well, if there was anything else she liked besides all this stuff she named. The protagonist thought about all these questions again. At the same time, she noticed that there might be sunflowers that look only at her. The little girl immediately imagined sunflowers and did not understand why her mother did not speak now. The girl, for her part, went on to say that she meant sunflowers, for everything else was of no consequence. At this, she thought her Coral and did not need to understand all this. And this was all because she was already noticing similar things in Kai. While the heroine was thinking about it, then the girl tried to connect the sunflowers, as well as the good men who had them talking at this time. But this, she did not succeed in any way at all. After a while, Macaroon sat in his room and pondered over the whole situation. He was now thinking about the fact that he had been paying attention to a lot of little things and even the menu of that very breakfast. But even despite all that, there was no progress at all. Of course, he knows perfectly well that this is not the way to do things, but perhaps right now he should take Miss Calypso away, yes, and that's it. All this time, the man's musings did not leave his head, and he did not realize what he should do. Suddenly, he turned his attention forward and saw that his son had entered his office. So he turned to him in surprise. The boy looked at him and then wondered what Daddy had done wrong to the new mom. He now looked at him in surprise and then inquired how he knew all this. The boy, in turn, did not answer this, but inquired why he had done all this. The man remarked that he certainly didn't think his son needed to be told this, but he didn't know what to do. The atmosphere between them was tense, and they couldn't find words for each other. He, in that moment, like true father and son, the two of them exhaled deeply. The man noticed that he seemed to have come all this way in search of the culprit in all of this. The kid noticed that all of this really wasn't at all like that Dad hadn't been eating well lately simply. At that moment, he had an envelope in his hand, so he put it on the table and remarked that he hoped it would help him after all. The man looked at the message with surprise, and his son told him that it was Coral who had given it to him. Macaroon, in turn, picked up the message and thought, did this Coral really write him a letter? He then began to look carefully to see what the girl had written for him. She had written that this was the man that her mother liked and outlined the points. This man should be reserved and naive, but depending on the situation with seductive, with a handsome face and a well-built body. Also, her mom's favorite things are sunflowers that look only at her mom, and this is very important. The man read this one carefully and then rejoiced that Coral and Kai were still willing to help him in order for him to make peace with her. At that moment, he was very grateful to them. After a while, His Majesty called for a butler named Momont. The fellow immediately entered the room and inquired if the prince had called him. The man remarked to buy sunflowers, which would only follow Lady Calypso. The subaltern listened attentively to his request and then looked up and wondered what he had just said. With surprise, he wondered where he should even find such sunflowers. The man remarked that if such sunflowers did not actually exist, then let him just create them. Momont looked at His Majesty and wondered if he should simply call a doctor. Macaroon, in turn, remarked that this one had planted the sunflowers of the Eastern Annex so that the lady would not recognize. The subordinate had nothing to do but agree to this request of His Majesty. The next day, the protagonist woke up and went to the window to get some fresh air. But suddenly, when she approached it, she felt some strange odor and thought where this floral fragrance came from. In order to find out where this fragrance came from, the girl went outside to see what was there. But when she opened the door, she was simply shocked by what she saw in front of her. There was a whole huge flower bed, which was planted only with sunflowers. With astonishment, the heroine looked at them and thought, since when did sunflowers grow here at all? Immediately, she began to ponder over the fact that perhaps Macaroon had planted them here. To top it all off, it was incomprehensible how he had managed to plant so many flowers in one night. Could it be that he switched from food to flowers? Of course, all this is really very beautiful, but it is unclear why he chose sunflowers out of all the flowers. The heroine began to walk little by little, but suddenly noticed something strange that was happening with the flowers. That's when she decided to test her theory and headed one way and then the other. And then she smiled and thought that it was not a dream after all. In fact, what she had seen turned out to be reality. The girl was happily running through a flower bed in which there were only sunflowers, and that followed her. She thought that you can only think of flowers that follow her. It is just amazing. On the friend of the heroine stopped because convinced a glimpse of something strange in the bushes. After that, she looked carefully there because she thought that before it seemed to her that there was someone there. She started to approach the tree to see if there was someone there. She thought perhaps Duke Shufin was there. If she really analyzed his character, he would have said hello to her. After that, she added that she must have seen something wrong. Immediately after that, she headed inside again to go to the table, for the children were already waiting for her there. And so the heroine went inside and said good morning to the children, but suddenly her attention was focused on the table, and all because she looked at one of the plates and there was a huge lobster, which lay and looked right at her. The heroine immediately wanted to eat it and thought, "Oh, this is the same big lobster." Immediately afterward, the girl turned to Kai and remarked to him to call his father. The boy looked at her in surprise and asked her what she had just said. Immediately after that, he looked at the girl next to him and realized that their plan must have worked after all. At that very moment, he hesitated and then declared that she would be right back with him. The heroine, in turn, asked to call him out because she felt sorry for Kai and Coral, who continued to watch the whole situation. And she did absolutely not do it because she fell for the lobster that was on the table. After a while, a boy came in with a man, and the son noticed that he had brought his own father. The girl looked at His Majesty and remarked for them to take a seat. The man stood in a confused look and thanked her for doing so. The heroine was surprised at that moment and thought that the master of the house was getting permission, and it was just some absurdity. Suddenly, she turned her attention to the prince and was a little surprised. All because she wondered if Macaroon was wearing makeup. Isn't that a version of the cute guy she's auctioning off? It turns out she totally didn't expect this, and he looks even worse than usual. Suddenly, the man turned to his wife with a smile on his face and asked if she thought he looked a little prettier today. After that, silence hung in the room, and the protagonist was shocked. She wondered if her companion had simply lost his mind. The prince went on to say that their anger empire and popularized the so-called good guy makeup. That's why he heard about it and decided to try it out. He further inquired if she liked it. The heroine then also thought that it was enough to answer in the affirmative. But if you leave it like that, then he is afraid he will continue to walk around with such a face. Therefore, stated that if a man talks about changes, she does not think that it suits his face. The makeup version is coming out soon after all, bad boy, and she thinks something like that would look better on his face. The boy along with the girl watched their conversation, and the son thought, "At least your dad came to his senses at this point." Suddenly, the daughter turned to her mom and remarked that she had told her before that she liked nice guys after all.